There are 3 pyramids at Giza. You already know that. Most people do. Big, ancient, desert, Egypt, that part everyone gets. But here's the thing that doesn't show up in the brochures or the school textbooks. The part that archaeologists and astronomers and mathematicians have been quietly arguing about for decades. Those 3 pyramids aren't just sitting there, they're placed. Deliberately, precisely, in a configuration that makes more sense the longer you stare at it and the more uncomfortable the questions become. Stand back far enough and you notice something is slightly off about the arrangement. The 3 pyramids don't form a straight line. The smallest one, Menkaures, is shifted slightly to the east, out of alignment with the other 2. For a civilization capable of squaring a 230-metre base to within a few centimetres of perfect, that offset is not a mistake. It's a choice. But why? That's where it gets interesting. And that's where the arguments start, because depending on who you ask, that pattern is either a reflection of 3 stars in the belt of Orion, or a deliberate decision rooted in geology and available bedrock, or a sophisticated piece of sacred urban planning, or a combination of all 3, or something else entirely that we haven't quite figured out yet. The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain. The pyramids are almost 5,000 years old. The people who built them left us monuments but not manuals. What survives is stone and math and a few papyrus fragments, and a whole lot of inference built on top of inference, built on top of careful observation. What we're going to do tonight is walk through the evidence slowly, not to prove one theory or demolish another, but to follow the actual shape of what's known, what's suspected, and what's genuinely mysterious. We'll look at the ground beneath the pyramids, what the ancient Egyptians were thinking when they chose that particular plateau above all others. We'll look at the way those structures face the cardinal directions with an accuracy that makes modern engineers raise their eyebrows. We'll look at the proportions baked into the slopes, the angles, the units of measurement, and ask whether those proportions are mathematical coincidence or deliberate code. We'll spend some time with the sky, with stars called the Imperishable ones, with the sun at solstice, and with the question of how much the ancient builders were actually looking upward when they decided what to build and where to put it. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, we'll sit with the Orion correlation theory, which is one of the most famous and most disputed ideas in all of alternative archaeology, and we'll try to treat it fairly. Not dismiss it, not crown it, just hold it up to the light and see what it actually explains and what it doesn't. Here's the frame that's worth holding on to as we go. Every piece of evidence we have about the pyramids has been filtered through time. Papyri decay, wood rots, paint fades. The people who made the actual decisions, the architects, the priests, the royal administrators, they're gone and they left behind something extraordinary but not explanatory. So when we look at patterns in the arrangement of the Giza complex, or alignments to stars or symbolic geometry, we're always working backward. We're people in the 21st century trying to reverse engineer the intentions of people in the 25th century, before the Common Era. That's a humbling distance, and the honest investigator holds that humility in one hand while holding the evidence in the other. None of that makes it less fascinating. If anything, it makes it more so, because the pyramids keep giving. New ground-penetrating radar surveys, cosmic ray muon imaging, satellite photography, all of it keeps turning up anomalies and voids and structural details that weren't visible before. There's still something inside some of these monuments that we haven't seen. Whatever is eventually found there may change the conversation entirely. Or it may confirm what we already suspected. We genuinely don't know yet, and that's a rare thing in a world where most ancient mysteries have been tidied up into comfortable answers. So the pattern, the thing you can't unsee once someone points it out to you. By the time we're done tonight, you'll have several different ways of understanding what that pattern might mean, none of them mutually exclusive, all of them grounded in something real. And you can decide for yourself which lens feels most true. If you're using this to fall asleep tonight, that's exactly what it's here for. I make these for the person lying in the dark with a restless mind, who wants something worth thinking about slowly. So subscribe if this is becoming part of your nights, and then tell me in the comments 2 things: where you are right now and what time it is for you. I check those comments, and every time it's a kind of map of the world at rest. Someone in Nairobi at midnight, someone in Vancouver at 11, someone in Mumbai just before dawn. It's its own kind of pattern, actually, global and quietly connected, just like the questions we're about to follow. Let's start at the very beginning, with the ground. Before we go any further, it's worth slowing down and being precise about what we're actually talking about. Because the Great Pyramids is one of those phrases that gets used loosely, and loose language leads to loose thinking. And loose thinking is exactly how a genuinely interesting historical question gets buried under a pile of mythology and misrepresentation. When most people say the Great Pyramids, they mean the 3 main structures at Giza. Khufu's pyramid, which the Greeks would later call Cheops, built around 2560 BCE, and for nearly 4,000 years, the tallest structure human beings had ever made. Khafra's pyramid, slightly smaller but positioned on higher ground so it looks almost the same height from a distance, a visual trick that some researchers think was entirely deliberate. And Menkaura's pyramid, noticeably smaller than the other 2, offset to the east in that way we mentioned, built by Khafre's son, and completed with a casing of granite rather than the white limestone that once covered its companions. These 3, sitting on the Giza Plateau on the west bank of the Nile just outside modern Cairo, are the ones at the centre of almost every theory, alignment claim, and mystery you've ever heard associated with the pyramids. But the story is actually much larger than Giza, and that larger context matters enormously when we start talking about patterns. The Egyptian pyramid tradition didn't begin at Giza, and it didn't end there. It spans roughly 1,000 years, from the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara around 2650 BCE, through the experimentation of the Old Kingdom, through Giza's high water mark, and then declining and being revived in modified forms, all the way into the Middle and New Kingdom periods. There are over 100 pyramids scattered across Egypt and Sudan, if you count smaller satellite structures and the later Nubian pyramids built by the Kushite kings. Some of those are collapsed ruins barely recognizable as pyramids at all. Others are remarkably intact. And when you look at all of them together, rather than just the 3 at Giza, certain things start to become visible that you'd never notice if you were staring only at the famous ones. Patterns emerge. And this is where we have to be very careful, because that word pattern does an enormous amount of work in conversations about ancient monuments, and it does not always do that work honestly. There are at least 5 different categories of pattern that researchers have identified and argued over when it comes to pyramids. The first is alignment, the way the structures are oriented to compass directions, to the rising and setting points of specific stars, to the path of the sun at particular times of year. The second is proportion, the ratios embedded in the angles of the slopes, the relationships between height and base, the units of measurement used, and what those ratios might encode or reflect. The third is site layout, the internal organization of the Giza complex itself, the way the 3 main pyramids relate to each other spatially, the positioning of the Sphinx, the valley temples, the causeways. The fourth is procession routes, the ceremonial pathways that connected the Nile to the pyramid complexes, which weren't arbitrary roads but carefully planned corridors with their own astronomical and symbolic logic. And the fifth is clustering, the fact that Egypt's major pyramid sites aren't randomly distributed across the landscape, but appear in a roughly linear concentration along a specific stretch of the Nile's west bank. Each of these pattern categories has its own evidence base, its own advocates, its own critics, and its own degree of certainty. Some patterns are virtually undisputed. The cardinal alignment of Khufu's pyramid, for instance, is a measurable physical fact, so precise it demands an explanation. Other patterns are much more contentious. The proposed correlation between the three Giza pyramids and three stars in Orion's belt is fascinating but contested in ways that matter, and that we'll spend real time on later. The honest approach is to carry both of those things at once, the rigorously established alongside the intriguingly speculative, without collapsing one into the other. Here's something worth understanding about why humans see patterns in the first place. Our brains are pattern recognition machines in the most literal neurological sense. We evolved to detect meaningful structure in complex environments because that skill kept us alive. The rustle of leaves that might be a predator, the shape of clouds that might mean rain, the clustering of berries that signals a productive foraging ground. That capacity to find signal in noise is one of our greatest cognitive gifts, and it is also the source of one of our most common cognitive errors. When we look at ancient monuments, we bring all of that ancient wiring with us. We see alignments that may be intentional, or may be the natural result of building square structures in a world where the cardinal directions exist. We see proportional relationships that may encode deliberate mathematical knowledge, or may be the inevitable byproduct of a consistent unit of measurement applied consistently over time. We see clustering that might reflect sacred geography or might reflect practical geography, namely the location of good bedrock, available labour and proximity to the capital. The human mind will find patterns even in randomness. That's not a flaw exactly, but it is a liability that good historians work actively to correct for. The way they correct for it is by asking a very specific question. Is there independent evidence that this pattern was intentional? Not just that the pattern exists, not just that it's geometrically remarkable, but that the people who built these things were aware of it and made choices in order to create it. Sometimes that evidence exists in the form of texts, in administrative records, in religious documents that describe the symbolic intentions behind the architecture. Sometimes it exists in the archaeology, in the way construction decisions changed mid-process in ways that only make sense if a specific alignment was being targeted. And sometimes the pattern is real, but the evidence for intention simply isn't there, which means we're left sitting with the honest and slightly uncomfortable position of saying this is genuinely unknown. Now, the basic timeline. The three main Giza pyramids were built over roughly a century, which sounds like a long time until you consider that they were built 4,500 years ago. Khufu ruled during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, somewhere around 2589 to 2566 BCE, depending on which chronology you use. His pyramid was the first and largest, and whoever designed it was working at a level of mathematical and logistical sophistication that still commands serious respect from modern engineers. Khafre was likely Khufu's son, ruling roughly 2558 to 2532 BCE, and he built the second pyramid, along with what most Egyptologists now believe was the Sphinx, though that attribution has its own set of controversies. Menkaure came after, ruling approximately 2532 to 2503 BCE, building the third and smallest pyramid, and perhaps intending to case it entirely in the more expensive granite before his reign ended. These were not isolated geniuses working in a vacuum. They had access to generations of accumulated architectural and administrative knowledge. The pyramid tradition had already been running for a century before Giza. The catastrophic collapse of the bent pyramid at Dashur, where the angle was changed mid-construction, presumably because the original slope was too steep for structural safety, told engineers things about load distribution and angle of repose that fed directly into Giza's designs. The three Giza rulers were building on the mistakes and discoveries of their predecessors. The patterns at Giza whatever they reflect, are partly the result of that accumulated learning, a tradition that knew what worked and repeated it deliberately. Which brings us to the expectation worth setting before we go any deeper. Some of the patterns we'll look at in this conversation are almost certainly intentional. When a civilization aligns a massive structure to true north with an accuracy within a fraction of a degree, that's not an accident. And it's not apophenia, which is the technical name for seeing meaningful patterns in meaningless data. That's engineering. When the same unit of measurement, the royal cubit, turns up in the proportions of structures built across a span of centuries by different rulers and different administrators, that consistency reflects a shared technical tradition, a deliberate set of standards passed down through an institution. But other patterns are less certain. Some may be coincidental, the natural result of building with consistent geometry in a landscape that already has its own geometry. Some may be real but misinterpreted, genuinely there in the stone, but pointing toward a meaning different from the one most often attached to them, and some may be exaggerated by the measuring instruments of enthusiastic pattern seekers who are working with numbers flexible enough to prove almost anything if you're willing to round generously. Our job tonight is to follow the evidence and stay honest about which category each pattern falls into. Not because the uncertain ones aren't interesting. They're often the most interesting, but because the mystery is richer and more durable when it's based on what's actually known, rather than on what sounds good in the dark. And there is more than enough that's actually known to keep us going a long, long time. If you want to understand why the Giza pyramids follow any pattern at all, you have to start somewhere much less glamorous than star charts or secret geometries. You have to start with the ground. And not just, there's some rock here, let's build on it, but with the specific, layered, slightly messy geology of a strip of desert on the west bank of the Nile. Because before a pyramid can be a symbol, it has to be a building. And buildings, especially heavy ones, are at the mercy of what they sit on. The Giza Plateau is not random. It's a tongue of limestone bedrock that rises gently out of the floodplain, a natural shelf standing above the annual Nile floods that would have turned lower ground into temporary swamp. From a pharaoh's point of view, that alone is attractive. You want your eternal resting place somewhere the river can't casually rearrange. Elevation did something else too. It made the site visible. Stand on the Nile in the Old Kingdom, when the river was a little wider and the banks a little less crowded with modern concrete. Look west, that ridge at Giza would have been a clear horizon, an edge of the world line. Anything large you put on it would announce itself to every boat gliding past on the water. A pyramid is a tomb, but it's also a billboard. You want people to see it and know whose power shaped it. So you have dryness, safety from floods, and a natural viewing platform. But the real gift of Giza is what lies inside that plateau, not just on top of it. The limestone there comes in layers and benches, with harder and softer bands. For a pyramid builder, that's a playground and a puzzle at the same time. The harder layers can be left in place as part of the foundation. The softer ones can be cut more easily into blocks. The plateau was, in a sense, both the floor and the quarry. Archaeologists have long noticed that the cores of the Giza pyramids aren't solid stacks of nice, neat, imported blocks. Large portions are built directly onto, and sometimes out of, the living rock of the plateau itself. In places, the builders simply carved the bedrock down to the level they wanted, and then stepped up from there with masonry. It's as if the natural hill is half swallowed inside the artificial mountain. This matters for patterns, because bedrock isn't a blank grid. It comes with bumps, ridges, fractures and slopes. If there's a natural high spot in just the right place, you might shift your pyramid's footprint a few meters to sit over it. If a band of weaker rock runs diagonally through the plateau, you might avoid putting your heaviest load right above it. These are boring practical choices, and they can nudge the final layout just enough to create the slightly offset alignments people later interpret as deliberate symbolic signals. Khufu's pyramid, the first and largest, occupies the northern, slightly higher part of the plateau on what seems to be a particularly strong bench of limestone. Khafre's sits to the southwest, again on stable rock, but making use of a natural rise so that his slightly smaller pyramid appears comparable in height. Menkaura's, the smallest, tucks in further south, on a lower part of the ridge, adjusted to the contours available to him. If you look at a simple map, that stagger can look mysterious. If you look at a geological cross-section, it starts to look like intelligent use of an uneven platform. This is one of the quiet themes that will come up again and again. The same feature can be read as sacred geometry or as structural engineering, and sometimes those two readings aren't actually in conflict. The plateau also solved another huge problem: where to get all that stone. A pyramid the size of Khufu's needs millions of blocks. Moving that much rock from far away would be a logistical nightmare even with trucks and cranes. The Egyptians did something much smarter. They used what was under their feet. Giza is ringed with quarries. Some dug right up against the pyramid foundations, others a short distance away. In aerial surveys, those quarries form shapes and scars that surround the monuments like negative impressions of the pyramids themselves. When you walk among the ruins, it's easy to focus on the rising masses of stone and forget the equal and opposite volumes that were carved away to make them. Those quarry pits and cuts, the ramps and ledges carved into them, and the routes that lead from them toward the construction sites are their own kind of geometry. Not the clean, ruler straight lines of a diagram, but practical, three-dimensional solutions to very physical questions. How do you get a 500-kilogram block from where you cut it to where you need it without killing every worker in the process? Causeways, the long monumental ramps linking each pyramid complex to its valley temple near the old floodplain, sit right in the middle of this. On the surface they're ceremonial roads, processional routes down which the king's body and offerings would travel between river and tomb. Underneath, they're also brilliant pieces of logistics. A straight, gently sloping corridor you can drag sledges along. A reliable path between water level and plateau that doesn't wash away every year. Those causeways had to go somewhere. They had to start near a landing place on the river or on a canal, and they had to end in a position that made architectural sense relative to the pyramid and the mortuary temple. That triangle of requirements, river access, stable bedrock, and a workable slope naturally restricts the options. You can't just spin the whole complex around like a dial without making the road absurdly steep or dropping it into bad ground. We know the Old Kingdom Egyptians modified their landscape heavily. They dug canals off the Nile. They built temporary harbours. Some researchers think there were seasonal water channels running right up toward the foot of the plateau, navigable at the height of the inundation. Boats could bring stone close to the building site, then hand off the loads to sledges and labour gangs for the last haul uphill. But water is fickle. The river meanders. Flood levels vary. Any canal or harbour you cut has to work with the existing topography and hydrology. You need banks that won't collapse, approaches that won't be underwater half the year, and access points where boats can safely tie up. All of that constrains where your valley temple can go. And once the valley temple's position is pinned down, the angle and length of your causeway are mostly dictated, and past a certain point, so is the relative placement of the pyramid. If you widen the lens beyond Giza, a pattern begins to emerge that looks less like a star map and more like a manual for large-scale construction on the Nile's west bank. Major pyramid fields, Saqqara, Dashur, Meidum, Giza, cluster along a belt where the geology is favourable, a band of solid bedrock close to the river, high enough to be safe from floodwaters, low enough to be accessible for labour and supply. Each site shows its own negotiated compromise between idealised layout and inconvenient reality. This ridge here, that wadi there, a hidden fault line best avoided, an ancient channel best exploited. Seen from this angle, the pattern is not an overlay imposed from the sky, but something that grows from the ground up. It's the logic of engineers who have to care about how stone behaves, how mud turns to glue when wet, how far you can ask a team of workers to pull before fatigue and friction eat your schedule. Once a society has solved those problems once, it doesn't want to solve them from scratch every time. Knowledge accretes, foremen remember which types of limestone flake badly. Surveyors learn how far from the floodplain you can build before supply lines become inefficient. Administrators work out how to schedule deliveries to match the rhythm of the Nile. Those solutions form habits, and those habits, when repeated at multiple sites by the same culture over generations, start to look from a distance like deliberate, almost mystical regularities. But you don't need a hidden civilization or extraterrestrial helpers to explain why a series of huge stone monuments in the same region share similar elevations, similar relationships to the river, similar orientations of paths and causeways. You just need a civilization that is paying attention, learning from its own experience, and working with, rather than against, the stubborn facts of geology and water. This doesn't mean the Egyptians were only practical. They layered meaning onto everything they touched. The west bank of the Nile was associated with the land of the dead. The desert edge where green turned to barren was symbolically charged long before the first large pyramid rose. When they chose Giza, they were certainly thinking about more than bedrock hardness. But the symbolism only works if the stones stay standing. So before we move on to the very precise, very intentional way those stones were turned to face the world, it's worth holding this in mind. Any pattern we're about to trace in the layout of the Giza pyramids sits on a foundation shaped by rock, by water, and by the roots along which human bodies could move heavy things. Next, we'll look at the most unambiguous of those patterns, the one you can verify with nothing more than a compass and a clear night sky. The way the pyramids are oriented to the cardinal directions, and what that does and doesn't tell us about what the builders were aiming for. If you strip away all the big claims, the wild diagrams, the arguments about secret codes, you're left with one pattern around the pyramids that almost everybody agrees on. They face north and south and east and west, not approximately. Not sort of pointing that way if you squint. The major Old Kingdom pyramids are aligned to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that, for their time, is astonishing. Khufu's Great Pyramid is the showpiece here. Survey after survey has found that its sides deviate from true north, south and east-west by only a tiny fraction of a degree. The error is so small that if you extend one face out for kilometres, it still hugs the cardinal line remarkably closely. Khafres and Menkaures are a little looser, but they're still impressively straight. Earlier pyramids at Meidum and Dashur follow the same basic rule, long axes locked onto the four quarters of the sky. Whatever else might be debated about pyramid patterns, this one feature is about as close as we get to firm ground. The builders cared about cardinal orientation, and they were very good at achieving it. How? Before compasses, before GPS, you can't just pull out a device and let it tell you where north is. You have to build north from scratch every time you plan a monument. So the Egyptians needed a reliable way to turn the sky and the sun into straight lines on the ground. One family of methods uses the sun's shadow. You plant a vertical pole, a gnomon, into level ground. In the morning, its shadow points roughly west. As the sun rises higher, the shadow shortens, swings around, lengthens again in the afternoon, pointing roughly east. If you carefully mark the tip of the shadow at intervals, you get a curve. But there are two special points on that curve, where the morning and afternoon shadows are exactly the same length. Connect those two spots with a straight line, and you found an east-west line. Draw a line at right angles to that, and you have north-south. This equal altitude method is simple in principle, but to do it with the kind of accuracy we see at Giza, you need patience, clear weather, a level surface, and some way of marking points precisely. You also need to average out the little wobbles from day to day, maybe by repeating the procedure and adjusting. If work crews did this over several days, then laid chords along the derived lines and checked them with sighting poles, you could, in theory, get very close to true cardinal points. Another solar technique uses noon. At true solar noon, the sun is due south in the northern hemisphere. The shadow of a vertical pole at that exact moment points due north. Catching that instant precisely, however, is trickier than it sounds. You have to track when the shadow is shortest, or when it stops moving and starts to lengthen. The Egyptians, who tracked the sun's daily path to regulate their agricultural and religious calendars, certainly had experience watching these subtle changes. It's not hard to imagine a specialized group of priest-surveyors, the rope stretchers we hear about in later texts, standing around a gnomon, waiting for the moment when the world's geometry seems to pause. Then there's the night sky. Some researchers think the Egyptians achieved their best alignments not with the sun, but with circumpolar stars, those stars near the north celestial pole that never rise or set but circle the horizon all night, the so-called imperishable stars. Imagine a clear, dry Egyptian night, long before light pollution. Two bright circumpolar stars on opposite sides of the pole rise and fall like the ends of a slow-motion seesaw. If you sight along the line that runs through them at just the right times, that line points very close to true north. If you build a simple sighting device, a plumb line in front of a vertical post, or a frame with a slit, you can watch those stars as they sweep the sky, and mark when they line up above the plumb bob. This transit method, as modern historians of science call it, can be extremely accurate. It also produces a telltale fingerprint. The position of the north celestial pole slides slowly across the background of stars thanks to the Earth's axial precession. Over centuries, the particular pair of stars you choose and the way you use them will generate slightly different north lines. When surveyors compare the tiny orientation errors of different pyramids, they notice a pattern. Early pyramids deviate from true north in one direction. Later ones deviate in the other. The curve of those deviations over time looks a lot like what you'd expect if generations of builders were using a stellar method that stayed conceptually the same but shifted slightly as the sky itself changed. If that interpretation is right, and not everyone agrees on the exact details, it gives us an eerie sense of continuity. Imagine temple architects inheriting a ritualized procedure. On a certain night in the year, at this place, watch those two stars. When they cross this line, you mark north. The ritual stays fixed for generations, but the heavens don't, and so each pyramid carries, frozen in its orientation, a small record of when it was laid out. Even if the exact scheme is still debated, most scholars would accept that some mix of stellar observations, solar shadows, and careful chord measurement underpinned these alignments. Because once you have your north line, you don't abandon it. You enshrine it in rope and stone. Egyptian surveying was, in many ways, rope engineering. Long cords stretched taut between stakes, checked, rechecked and adjusted, could define straight building axes over tens or hundreds of meters. Diagonals could be set out using right-angle triangles, possibly with simple integer ratios. Reference points could be cut into bedrock and used to extend lines as the site developed. A single, accurately established cardinal axis could propagate through an entire complex. Pyramid, temples, walls, subsidiary chapels. So why was this so important? Why go to this much trouble to make an artificial mountain point toward abstract directions? For the Egyptians, the cardinal directions weren't abstract. They were stitched into the structure of the cosmos. East was where the sun rose, where Ra emerged each morning from the horizon. West was where he sank and entered the underworld, the realm with which the desert necropolises were so closely associated. North, above all, was the region of those imperishable stars that never disappeared below the horizon, symbols of eternity and unending life. South pointed up the Nile toward the origins of the river and older ancestral lands. To set a king's tomb precisely into this four-part frame was to nail his monument onto the skeleton of the universe as they understood it. It was an act of mat, of putting things in proper order. Mat wasn't just truth or justice in a vague moral sense. It was the right arrangement of everything. The Nile's flood at the correct height, the stars on their proper paths, fields measured and remeasured, temples aligned with the turning of the year. A pyramid whose faces confronted the four quarters of the world declared in stone that the king upheld that order, and that in death he was being slotted into the same cosmic grid he'd preserved in life. The cardinal orientation also tied into kingship more directly. From the pyramid's north side, shafts and passages seemed to gesture toward the circumpolar stars, where the king's spirit might join the undying ones. From the east, mortuary temples opened toward the rising sun, receiving light and offerings. The everyday practicalities of movement, priests bringing food, families visiting chapels, were woven into a cosmological choreography that assumed fixed, meaningful directions. This is where the small deviations from perfection become intriguing rather than disappointing. Khufu's alignment is almost eerily precise. Khafre's is a touch less so. Menkare's is a little looser again. Earlier experiments at Meidum and Dashur show their own characteristic offsets. These aren't random mistakes. They cluster, they trend, they shift over time. One reading is that different reigns emphasize different techniques. Perhaps Khufu's architects perfected a stellar alignment method at its peak, while later builders relied more on solar techniques that introduced slightly larger errors. Or perhaps environmental factors, haze, dust, atmospheric refraction, made certain methods difficult at some times of year. The errors might encode shifts in ritual practice, a new correct night, a new pair of guiding stars. Another possibility is simply that after Khufu, no one felt the need to push for quite that level of geometric exactitude. His pyramid had made the point. Later, kings still cared about facing the cosmic quarters, but once your walls are within a tiny fraction of a degree of true north, further refinements are invisible to the naked eye. The ritual requirement, align it to the four directions, was satisfied long before the surveyor's last decimal place. What's clear is that orientation didn't stop with the pyramid's base. Causeways, those long ceremonial and logistical ramps, tend to run at deliberate angles off the pyramid's axis. Khafre's causeway, for instance, leans south of east, not randomly, but in a way that seems to relate to sightlines towards specific points on the horizon. Valley temples at the lower ends of causeways, perched near river level, echo and extend the directional logic, tying the cardinally oriented pyramid to the turning seasons, the floodplain, and the path of the sun. Across the plateau, the broader temple complexes show a mesh of alignments, some tightly locked to north, south, and east-west, others skewed to meet natural features, earlier monuments, or significant horizon points. The cardinal grid becomes the underlying reference frame, a kind of invisible graph paper on which more local, more nuanced lines are drawn. When you walk through this landscape in your mind, north-facing pyramid faces, eastward opening chapels, slanting causeways, you begin to sense that the mysterious pattern is not a single secret, but a layered logic. At its base is a very simple idea. Fix your monuments to the stable reference directions of the world. On top of that, adjust, bend and weave to connect them with the river, the sun's path, older sacred places, and the practical needs of moving people and stone. In the next part, we'll widen the lens from a single pyramid to the full complexes, enclosure walls, subsidiary pyramids, temples and tombs. There another kind of pattern emerges, not just where the monuments point, but how they cluster and repeat, like a template stamped again and again onto the desert edge. If you zoom in on the Great Pyramid in your imagination, it's easy to see it as a solitary thing. 4 perfect faces, a point stabbing the sky, a clean geometric object sitting by itself on the desert. But a king was never buried in a lone triangle of stone dropped in the sand. Every major royal pyramid of the Old Kingdom sits inside a little universe of architecture. Once you know the pieces, you start to see the same constellation over and over again, shifting slightly but recognizably from reign to reign. Start at the river. Down near what would have been the edge of the Nile's floodplain, each pyramid complex tends to have a valley temple. This is the low point, literally and ritually. It's where the king's body, brought by boat along the canal from the royal palace or the city, first enters the sacred zone. The valley temple is usually a solid, squat building, heavy on stone, with a relatively simple ground plan by later Egyptian standards. It's a threshold, outside the messy, changing world of people and fields and floodwaters. Inside, polished stone, ordered space, the first step into a controlled ritual environment. From that quiet, shadowed room by the river, a line of architecture stretches up toward the desert edge. This is the causeway, more than just a ramp for hauling stone. Though it did that work in the construction phase, it becomes, in the finished complex, a sacred corridor. Roofed or partially roofed, decorated on the inside. It connects the humid, river-smelling valley with the dry, blazing plateau. If you were a priest walking in procession, this is where your feet would trace the same path again and again. Up from the lowest point of the world, step by step, into the bright, still air around the pyramid. At the upper end of the causeway, hugging the east face of the pyramid, sits the mortuary temple. This is the real heart of the complex, ritually speaking. Here is where daily offerings are made to the dead king. Bread, beer, meat, incense. Here is where priests recite the spells that keep his spirit fed and functioning in the afterlife. Here is where families, later officials, even other kings might come to perform commemorative rites. Architecturally, mortuary temples in the 4th and 5th dynasties share a family resemblance. A forecourt where people can gather, an inner hall with pillars or columns, a sanctuary space tucked nearer the pyramid, storage rooms for offerings, often a false door or series of chapels where the king's ka, his life force, could receive nourishment. Picture the pattern: valley temple at the bottom, causeway as the ritual spine, mortuary temple at the top, pressed against a cardinally aligned pyramid. That 3-part sequence appears again and again at Midum, at Dashur, at Giza, at Abusir. Different rulers, different reigns, same basic template. And then there are the satellites. Most of the major pyramids have one or more smaller pyramids clustered nearby. Some are for queens, consorts whose own burials needed to be close to the king's divine presence. Others are more mysterious, tiny satellite pyramids whose internal structures are minimal or symbolic. Their exact function is debated. They might be tied to particular aspects of the king's soul, to ritual equipment, or to celestial and solar symbolism we don't fully grasp. But their placement is not random. They tend to sit along the same cardinal grid, often hugging the south or east sides of the main pyramid, like smaller echoes of the Great Mass. At Giza, Khufu's Queen's Pyramids line up to the east, forming a neat row parallel to the Great Pyramid's base. Menkaura's 3 little pyramids cluster to his south, tiered like a miniature mountain range. Some complexes also include long, narrow pits in the bedrock near the pyramid, shaped like the hulls of inverted boats. These are the boat pits. In a few cases they've yielded real, full-sized wooden vessels, the famous solar boat of Khufu, for instance, nestled disassembled in a trench beside his pyramid. These boats seem to have been intended as vehicles for the king's journey, across the sky with the sun god, or through the underworld's rivers. Again, once you know to look, they become part of the repeating set. Valley Temple Causeway, Mortuary Temple, Main Pyramid, Satellite Pyramids, Boat Pits. A kit of sacred components, shuffled slightly but recognizably the same from king to king. This is one way to think about the mysterious pattern of the pyramids, not as a hidden code in their measurements, but as a template for how to build the afterlife in stone. Why did this template repeat so reliably? Part of the answer is ritual choreography. Imagine that funeral procession again. The dead king's body, washed and wrapped, arrives at the Valley Temple by boat. There are rites of purification, of transition. Then the cortege moves up the causeway. The linearity is important. The path from water to desert, from east to west, from life to death is walked, not just symbolized. Geometry follows footsteps. If the Valley Temple must be at river level and the Mortuary Temple must be at the pyramid's eastern foot, the causeway's angle and length fall out of those constraints. If offerings must be brought daily from storage spaces in the Mortuary Temple into chapels aligned with the pyramid's axis, then doorways and halls tend to be placed in similar relationships to the pyramid's faces each time. Ritual scripts harden into architectural diagrams. Another part of the answer is standardization, both religious and administrative. By the time Khufu is building at Giza, royal pyramid building is already a tradition, not an experiment. Earlier kings have tried out versions of this complex at Saqqara, at Maidum, at Dahshur. Texts and inscriptions from later periods hint at ritual manuals, lists of what must be done, how, and in what sequence. Even if we don't have those Old Kingdom documents, we can feel their ghost in the stone. If certain rites are thought to be essential for the king's safe passage, purifications, offerings, recitations, then you need spaces to hold those rites. Spaces that function in reliable, known ways. You don't rewrite the entire map every reign. You copy the previous successful layout, with embellishments. Administration pushes in the same direction. Large building projects require bureaucracy, overseers, crews, supply chains. If the floor plan of a mortuary temple is broadly similar from king to king, then experienced architects and craftsmen know what to expect. Storage rooms, offering halls, statue niches, these become standardized modules. The whole complex becomes a kind of reproducible product, adapted to each king's reign, but familiar enough that the machine of state can crank it out. Religious continuity reinforces that. The Egyptians cared deeply about doing things as before. A rite loses power if it's performed wrongly in the wrong place, facing the wrong way. So the memory of earlier successful complexes shapes new ones. The template isn't just convenient, it's sacred precedent. Still, the pattern is not a rigid stamp. Each king's complex introduces its own variations. This is where Giza becomes especially interesting. Khufu's complex sets a kind of benchmark, enormous main pyramid, 3 queens' pyramids to the east, a cluster of boat pits, a valley temple down toward the ancient floodplain, a causeway rising up to a substantial mortuary temple on the east. Around all that, a wide field of mastaba tombs for nobles and officials, oriented to the same cardinal grid. It is, in some ways, the full version of the template. Khafre, building just to the south, follows the script but bends it. His pyramid is slightly smaller in base, but appears taller because it sits on higher bedrock. His causeway runs at a different angle, slanting more to the south as it climbs, carving its own line through the plateau's invisible grid. His valley temple, uniquely well preserved, is a heavy, almost megalithic structure, with enormous limestone and granite blocks. The Sphinx and its temple, sitting just east of Khafre's causeway, add another layer that isn't simply a copy of Khufu's arrangement. Menkaure, at the southern end, shrinks the scale but keeps the components. Main pyramid, 3 small pyramids tucked neatly along its south side, a causeway, a valley temple, a mortuary temple that would be altered and expanded even after his death. His complex shows more use of granite casing, more intricate internal planning in the temples, as if later generations were experimenting within the inherited frame. The differences matter because they show us that we're not looking at a mindless repetition of a blueprint. We're watching a tradition negotiate between stability and innovation. Each king accepts the basic grammar of the pyramid complex: valley, temple, causeway, mortuary temple, satellite pyramids, boat pits, but speaks it with a slightly different accent. A steeper or shallower causeway, a mortuary temple with more or fewer pillars. Boat pits placed on one side rather than another. New statues, new relief programs, new emphases within the same skeletal plan. In that tension between the repeated template and the unique expression, another level of pattern starts to emerge. Not just what pieces are there, but how are they arranged across the plateau as a whole. To see that, you have to pull back a little further, beyond a single king's afterlife machine, and look at the skyline itself, the way pyramids, temples and causeways thread together to make a planned sacred landscape stretching along the desert's edge. Stand at the imaginary edge of the ancient floodplain again, and look up, not at one pyramid, but at the whole line of desert to the west. In your mind's eye, erase the apartment blocks and highways and tourist buses. Let the Nile wander in its broader, older channel. Let the fields be green strips hugging the water. Let the desert cliff stand cleaner, its limestone face catching the low sun. Now drop the pyramids back into place. They're not scattered like dice. They're strung along a narrow band where fertile land gives way to stone. Saqqara, Dashur, Giza, Abusir el-Melik, a repeating rhythm of monuments from north to south, each one close enough to the valley that the king can still see and be seen, but high enough on the rock that his tomb stays dry and safe. Visibility is part of the point. A pyramid is not just a tomb, it's a statement. A few million tons of statement in Khufu's case. When you live on the East Bank, planting and harvesting year after year, those angled sides on the horizon become part of the mental landscape. You look up from your work and there it is, the king's eternal mountain, gleaming when it was new, the casing stones catching light. Even if you never go up to the plateau, even if you never set foot in the mortuary temple, the pyramid looks back at you. Archaeologists sometimes talk about monumental communication. It's a dry phrase for something pretty visceral. The sheer mass, the clean geometry, the way a structure gathers your gaze and holds it, that's power, carved into the skyline. In a world without billboards, without television, without newspapers, the king's ideology is written in stone silhouettes. But the Egyptians didn't just plant these silhouettes anywhere. Once you start comparing sites, it becomes clear that the desert's edge, the natural line where cultivation ends and rock begins, acts like a kind of planning grid. The plateau is not flat like a tabletop. It has low ridges, shallow basins, old wadis where water once flowed. Some stretches of cliff are higher, some lower. Some spots offer a broad, commanding view over the valley. Others are tucked away behind outcrops. When you put a pyramid on one of these rises, you're not only thinking about foundations and bedrock, you're thinking about where it will appear on the horizon from down below. Look at Giza. Khufu's pyramid occupies the northern, slightly higher part of the plateau. Khafre's, just to the south, is perched on a little swell of bedrock that lets it rival his father's monument in apparent height, even though the base is smaller. Menkares sits lower, further south, completing a diagonal run along the ridge. From certain points in the ancient floodplain, those three line up in a stepped recession, each slightly offset, each staking a claim on the skyline. Is that deliberate? Most Egyptologists would say yes, at least in broad strokes. The builders were working with a known landscape, with surveyors who could walk out into the fields and sight back to the cliff edge, adjusting locations until they were satisfied with the relationship between plateau and valley. Now zoom your mind's eye in closer to the causeways. These long, narrow corridors don't just connect low temple to high temple at random angles. Their orientations create sightlines, controlled visual tunnels through the architecture. Khafre's causeway, for example, channels movement and line of sight toward his pyramid. But it also brushes past the Sphinx and its temple, tying those elements into a shared ritual axis. At other sites, you see similar intentional alignments. Causeways angled so that, at certain times of year, the rising or setting sun pours light along their length. Mortuary temples positioned so that standing in one doorway, you see not only the face of the king's pyramid, but a glimpse of another monument further along the plateau, or a particular cut in the cliff. We can't always be sure what every line was meant to show. But the repetition of the basic pattern, valley temple, diagonally climbing causeway, east-facing mortuary temple pressed to the pyramid, creates a kind of shared vocabulary of sightlines. Each complex inserts its own phrase into the larger sentence written across the desert margin. Over time, those phrases start talking to each other. Later builders weren't working on an empty canvas. By the time the 5th dynasty kings start placing their pyramids at Abu Sir, the pyramids at Giza are already there, already dominating the northern horizon. There is good evidence that these later kings are responding to what's been done before. At Abu Sir, several pyramids seem to be aligned in relation not only to each other, but to Heliopolis on the east bank, the great sun cult center. If you draw lines from the corners of certain Abbasid pyramids toward Heliopolis, or stand at Heliopolis and sight west, you get suggestive correspondences. Not perfect laser-straight alignments, but close enough that many scholars see intent rather than accident. The king's tomb literally facing the city of the sun god Ra. Something similar may be happening at Dashur and Saqqara, where earlier and later pyramids echo slopes, reuse orientations, or line up their eastern faces along similar north-south runs. A king could choose to place his monument directly south of a predecessor's, visually extending an existing row. Or he might deliberately offset it, staking out his own subzone on the plateau while still keeping to the general band along the desert's edge. In this way, the plateau becomes a palimpsest of royal decisions. Each new pyramid doesn't just occupy space, it comments on, reinforces, or gently subverts an existing pattern. There is a social and political dimension here too. If you are a new king taking the throne after a long reigning predecessor, you might want your pyramid to proclaim continuity. I stand in the same line as the great ones before me, aligning your complex so that your causeway roughly parallels theirs, or your mortuary temple sits on a similar east-west axis, is one way to inscribe that continuity into the very bones of the landscape. On the other hand, if you're trying to emphasize a fresh start, a new cult focus, or a different set of divine allies, you might tweak the formula. Shift your causeway a few degrees, Anchor your valley temple nearer a particular canal. Let your pyramid catch a different part of the skyline from the perspective of the capital city. The Egyptians didn't leave us architectural manifestos spelling out these choices. We read them indirectly through measurements, orientations, and the slow accumulation of comparative data from one site to another. But the pattern that emerges is not chaos. It's rhythm with variation. This is also where we have to be careful. When modern people look at maps full of pyramids and temples, it's tempting to draw lines between everything and see hidden messages, triangles connecting sites hundreds of kilometers apart, alignments to specific stars and dates and distant mountain peaks. Some of these claims are imaginative rather than evidential. If you have enough points on a map, you can always play connect the dots and find alignments that are just chance. Archaeologists tend to set a higher bar. When they talk about alignments and sightlines, they look for patterns that show up repeatedly, that make sense in terms of ancient Egyptian religion and practice, and that fit what we know about their surveying capabilities. The consistent cardinal orientation of major pyramids clears that bar. The repeated placement of complexes along the cultivated desert boundary does too. So do some of the intersite relationships with major cult centres like Heliopolis. What's less secure are long-distance geometric games that require assuming centimetre-level precision over tens of kilometres, or intentions that would have meant nothing to the people actually using the sites. A farmer in the Old Kingdom could see the pyramid on his local horizon. He could not see an abstract triangle connecting Giza, Heliopolis, and some faint point far to the south. So in thinking about the planned sacred landscape, it helps to stay grounded. The planning grid is the terrain itself, the Nile, the floodplain, the rising desert. The reference points are visible places of power, the royal residence, the Sun Temple, the Plateau cliffs. The sightlines that mattered were the ones you could actually experience, moving along a causeway, standing in a temple doorway, looking up from your field in the early morning, and seeing the sun catch the white casing stones. Within those constraints, the Egyptians built something remarkably coherent, a chain of royal mountains stitched to the valley by ceremonial roads, each complex a self-contained ritual machine, and all of them together forming a continuous sacred fringe along the western horizon. Once you see it that way, the mysterious pattern clicks into a new focus. It's not just in the measurements of a single pyramid. It's in the way all of them, from site to site and century to century, participate in a shared composition, one that uses site and line and landscape itself as part of the architecture. And inside those massive forms, behind the clean outer faces and the bright casing stones, there's another layer of pattern lurking, this time in angles and ratios in the very geometry of the slopes. Walk closer in your mind until the pyramid fills your field of view. The clean triangle you saw on the horizon resolves into courses of stone, blocks as tall as your chest, joints you can still slip a fingertip into, thousands of years later. And that elegant, simple outline, the sweep from base to summit, turns out to be the result of hundreds of small, stubborn decisions. Because a pyramid doesn't have to look like that. You could make the sides steeper, a sharp needle stabbing the sky. You could make them shallow, more like a long, lazy ramp. You could stack terraces, step style, and never smooth them at all. Early Egyptian pyramids actually tried some of these options. They experimented. They failed. They learned. Somewhere in that learning slope became a choice. And once it was chosen, it could be repeated. When modern people talk about slope, we reach for decimals and degrees. 30-ish degrees. 40-something. But an Old Kingdom engineer wasn't sketching 51.84 degrees on a blueprint. They were thinking in hands. The basic unit was the royal cubit, about the length of a forearm from elbow to fingertip. That cubit was divided into palms, 4 of them, and each palm into fingers, 4 again. So 16 fingers to a cubit, a neat little grid built into a single measuring rod. You can imagine the surveyor's toolkit, a wooden cubit rod scored with lines, knotted cords of known length, plumb bobs on strings, simple A-frame levels to find horizontal, perhaps sighting rods to keep lines straight. Nothing fancy, but when everybody measures with the same sticks and cords, precision becomes a social habit. Now, think about how you'd define a pyramid slope using nothing but those lengths. You don't need trigonometry. You just need a rule like, for every cubit you go up, you go this many cubits in. A rise over a run. A ratio. The Egyptians had a neat way to talk about that ratio. They called it the seeked picture. Half the base of the pyramid, from the centre line out to the middle of one side. As you go up 1 cubit in height, how many palms does the side move inward? That sideways shift measured in palms per cubit of rise is the seeked. It's an engineer's description of steepness that doesn't care about angles in degrees at all. It cares about how your blocks step back, course by course. For the Great Pyramid, that sideways retreat works out to a seeked that corresponds in our language to a face angle just under 52 degrees. If you climb it in your imagination, each layer nudges back just a little from the one below, following that invisible rule encoded in cubits, palms and fingers. Why that particular steepness? Part of the answer is painfully practical. Too steep, and your structure wants to peel away, especially if you smooth it with fine casing stones. Too shallow, and you're hauling stone much farther for the same height, wasting labour for less impressive effect. Somewhere between those extremes is a sweet spot where the masonry behaves itself and still feels monumental. You can watch the trial and error process on the plateau at Darshore. Sneferu's bent pyramid begins at a steep angle, then, part-way up, the builders change their minds. The slope breaks. The upper part is shallower, as if they realised the original design was flirting too closely with collapse. Nearby, his red pyramid uses a more forgiving angle from the ground up. Lesson learned, risk dialed back. By the time you reach Giza, that learning has hardened into confidence. Khafre's pyramid, Khufu's slightly earlier monument, Menkare's smaller one to the south. They aren't all identical, but they cluster around a familiar range of slopes. A band of safe but impressive that builders clearly trusted. Within that band, repeatable proportions emerge almost automatically. Imagine you're laying out Khufu's pyramid from scratch. You fix a base length in cubits. You pick a seeked value. How many palms of instep per cubit of rise that your team knows how to execute? Once those two choices are made, everything else follows. The height of the pyramid is now mathematically locked in. The length of each face is locked in. The shape of every internal diagonal, every imagined cross-section, becomes a simple consequence of that base and that slope. You don't have to be aiming for a mysterious constant to end up with consistent ratios. You just have to keep using the same toolbox and the same habits. This is where modern fascination with numbers comes storming in. People have noticed that if you take the Great Pyramid's height and base and juggle them in certain ways, you can get numbers approximating pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, or phi, the so-called golden ratio that crops up in spirals and rectangles and art history lectures. Is that real? Did the Egyptians deliberately encode these constants into their design? Most Egyptologists lean toward caution here. On one hand, Egyptian scribes were no fools. They had practical ways of approximating areas and volumes. Some of their rules for calculating the area of a circle, for instance, effectively use a value for pi that's not too shabby. They clearly grasped that certain proportions worked in geometry and in construction. On the other hand, we don't have papyri saying, build the pyramid so that its perimeter equals a circle with radius equal to its height. We don't see Old Kingdom notations of phi. What we do see are instructions written in terms of cubits and seconds and fractions of fingers. Recipes for slope, not manifestos about universal constants. If you set up your pyramid with a nice whole number ratio, say a certain number of cubits up for a certain number sideways, you can, without meaning to, land near values that we later define as pi or phi. Pick a base of 440 cubits. Give it a slope that's easy to lay out with a secant that uses neat fractions. You might, by coincidence, end up with a perimeter that's not too far from 2 pi times the height. Is that intentional? Maybe. Maybe not. The numbers alone can't tell you. What we can say is that the builders didn't need our modern notation to be astonishingly consistent. Think about the process on the ground. Once the base is squared and oriented, teams stack blocks in horizontal courses. Each course has to step in a little, following guiding lines. Masons can check the retreat using a measuring rod laid along the face, or a cord stretched diagonally. Foremen can walk along, counting fingers of inset per vertical cubit, making sure no crew drifts off the agreed secant. Day after day, year after year, hundreds of workers enforcing the same simple rule. Human averaging takes over, small deviations smooth out. The overall surface keeps to its chosen slope with an accuracy that still impresses engineers today. There's another layer of repeatability hidden in the stones themselves. When you quarry blocks of roughly standard height, the vertical rise of each course becomes predictable. If a block is, say, half a cubit tall on average, you know that 2 courses raise the face 1 cubit. If your secant calls for, say, 5 palms of setback per cubit, then every 2 courses should pull the edge in that much. A foreman doesn't need calculus. He needs a good eye, a good rod, and a memory for simple whole number relationships. Over multiple projects, that memory gets institutional. A successful slope on one king's pyramid becomes a benchmark. Scribes record its secant. Architects refer to it. A new king may order, as steep as my father's, or a little gentler. Adjust the secant by a palm or a finger, and the whole silhouette shifts, but the method stays the same. Continuity wrapped around small variations, and so a pattern appears. Not an abstract mystical code baked into stone, but a human pattern, preferences that solidify into standards, rules of thumb turned into tradition. Certain slopes feel right, stable, regal, pleasing. Certain proportions between base and height give the impression of a mountain rather than a squat platform or a precarious spike. Once those proportions become part of how royal authority looks, engineers are incentivized to hit them, again and again, for each new monument. From the valley you never see the secant. You just see the smooth rush of limestone to a point. But under that elegant face is a lattice of tiny ratios, cubits and palms and fingers stacked into a geometric habit the Egyptians could reproduce without ever writing down a single equation. Later, other cultures will wrap mystique around these numbers. They'll see pi and phi in the stones and imagine an ancient secret mathematics. The reality may be quieter and in its way more impressive. A civilization that with simple tools and a shared measuring language could turn geometry into craft, and craft into something that still holds its line on the horizon, thousands of years after the last surveyor put away his rod. And those lines of stone don't just point inward, toward the king. Many of them also tilt outward, upward, toward the sky. The next layer of pattern moves from earthbound ratios to star paths and never-setting lights, where the same instinct for repeatable geometry meets the slow, predictable motion of the heavens. In the Egyptian imagination, The sky above the pyramid wasn't empty. It was populated, structured, alive with destinations. If you'd asked an Old Kingdom priest where the dead king was going, he wouldn't have said heaven in some vague modern way. He would have pointed quite specifically to a region of the night sky. The north, for the Egyptians who built the Great Pyramids, the northern sky held a special category of stars, the ones that never set, the stars that circle the pole and from Egypt's latitude glide around and around without dipping below the horizon. They called them the Ikemu Sek, often translated as the imperishable ones. That word, imperishable, is doing a lot of work. These are stars that do not die each night by sinking into the underworld. They do not pass through the dangerous western horizon where sun and spirits descend. They're always present, always circling. If you are a king who wants an eternal existence, this is exactly the company you want to keep. Royal funerary texts from a slightly later age preserve echoes of what Old Kingdom priests were already chanting. The king joins the imperishable stars. He sits among them like a star. He does not perish. He does not decay. To us, these are poetic metaphors. To them, they were coordinates. So when we talk about astronomical patterns at the pyramids, we're not importing a modern obsession with space into an ancient site. We're following a thread the Egyptians themselves left in their own words. But there's more than one way to bring stars into a monument. On one level, you can use them like a tool. If you want your pyramid sides to face the cardinal directions very, very accurately, the night sky is your friend. We've already seen how obsessively the builders oriented the bases of the Giza pyramids. Deviations from true north are tiny, so tiny that simple guesswork or point it at where the sun rises isn't really enough. One plausible method: use circumpolar stars to find north. Imagine a priest surveyor standing on the prepared ground, sighting along a straight pole or using a simple merket, a plumb line with a sight. He watches two bright stars near the pole as they wheel through the night. When they line up vertically, passing across the invisible meridian that runs from north to south, he marks that moment. Do this carefully enough, night after night, and you can fix a north-south line with remarkable precision. In this sense, the stars are instruments, the pattern is functional. Align your monument to the grid of the heavens, and you've locked it into a cosmic frame of reference that doesn't drift on the timescale of a human life. But on another level, the stars are a destination and a story. You can orient your pyramid north, because that's the best way to get your corners straight. Or you can orient your pyramid north, because that's where the imperishable ones are. Those two motives don't cancel each other out. They can coexist in the same act. This is where symbolism and engineering braid together. When we move from the big, bold gesture of orientation to the more intimate features of the Great Pyramid, the symbolism gets even louder. Inside Khufu's pyramid, two of the so-called air shafts, narrow, sloping channels carved from the king's chamber, run upward and outward at fixed angles. They are too small for people to walk through. For a long time, they were simply thought of as ventilation. But the king's chamber doesn't really need ventilation. And the shafts aren't arranged in the easiest way to move air. They kink, they dogleg, they seem intentional, but not in a purely practical sense. So people began to ask a different question. What if these are not air shafts, but sky shafts? If you extend their lines out into the night, where do they point? Some researchers have argued that, at the time the pyramid was built, one northern shaft would have aimed toward a region near specific circumpolar stars. Not a laser-precise beam on a single pinpoint of light. Ancient builders didn't have that kind of optical equipment, but a broad directional gesture toward that never-setting cluster, the home of the imperishable ones. The southern shaft from the same chamber, in some reconstructions, points toward bright stars in constellations. The Egyptians would connect with Osiris and the solar cycle. Is that a deliberate celestial targeting system? Or is it a case of us drawing lines on our maps after the fact and marvelling at how nicely they land? We don't have an Old Kingdom blueprint saying, angle this shaft exactly so to reach this star. We have stones, angles we can measure, and texts written centuries later that talk about the king mounting to the northern sky. There's a similar ambiguity with other features. Passages, for instance. The entrance corridor on the north face of a pyramid doesn't just lead inward. It has a tilt, a direction. Does that incline echo a path the soul is meant to take, slanting up toward a particular celestial region? Or is it just a structurally convenient way to burrow into the core and reach the planned burial chamber? We can calculate the angle of a shaft down to fractions of a degree. We can model the ancient night sky, factoring in the slow wobble of Earth's axis that changes which stars are circumpolar over millennia. Those are measurements. But when we say this angle surely must have been chosen to point here, to this star, for this metaphysical reason, we've crossed a line into interpretation. Some interpretations are gentle, taking their cue from Egyptian texts. They say, the king goes to the northern imperishable stars, so features aimed broadly northward symbolically open that way, whether or not they hit one particular star dead on. Others are more assertive, mapping specific shafts to specific stars, and building elaborate narratives around that alignment. Those will show up later when we talk about one of the most famous sky-based theories. For the moment, we can keep two separate but overlapping ideas in view. 1. Stars as a practical surveying grid. Lights that let you draw north-south and east-west in a way no mountain or river can guarantee. 2. Stars as a religious landscape. Real places in the sky where a royal soul is expected to travel, join, or reign. When you look at the Great Pyramid with both lenses at once, certain patterns feel almost inevitable. Of course, you centre your monument on the cardinal directions. That's the backbone of order. Of course, you privilege the north. That's where eternity circles. Unsetting, of course you imagine pathways, metaphorical or architectural, that connect the dark interior, where the body lies with the bright, unending motion overhead. But the exact details, the claim that this shaft equals this star equals this single myth, are more fragile. We know the Egyptians cared about the north. We know they spoke of imperishable stars, and the king becoming one of them. We know their surveyors could in principle use the night sky to achieve the alignments we admire. We do not know that every angle and passage was consciously tuned to a specific stellar target. So, as we drift in this story from the solid ground of geometry into the softer twilight of symbolism, it's worth holding on to the difference between what is firmly measurable and what is plausibly meaningful. A face aligned within a tiny fraction of a degree of true north? Measurable. A narrow shaft aimed generally toward the circumpolar zone, in a world where the king is promised a place among the imperishable stars. Plausibly symbolic. A complex theory that ties multiple monuments to an intricate stellar picture, decades or centuries apart, with messages only decipherable by modern software. That's where debate begins. In the next sections, we'll walk gently into that debate. We'll explore one of the most famous claims about the Giza layout and the constellation of Orion, and we'll weigh it against this quieter background. A culture that already wove stars into its royal theology, already used the sky as both ruler and roadmap, and yet left us very few explicit instructions for decoding its patterns. For now you can imagine the plateau at night. The white casing stones gleam in starlight. The huge mass of each pyramid is fixed to the earth, but its lines, its corridors, its unseen channels are all subtly tilted, nudged, beckoning upward. Below, stone and bedrock and cubit rods, above the slow wheel of imperishable lights. Between them a pattern, part engineering, part hope, that we are still learning how to read. If you've ever fallen down a late-night rabbit hole about the pyramids, you've almost certainly met it. The idea that the 3 great pyramids at Giza are not just 3 big tombs in a row, but a stone map of 3 particular stars. The stars of Orion's belt. In its simplest form, the Orion correlation theory says this: take a clear, dark Egyptian night. Look south. Find Orion, the great hunter striding across the sky. Look for the 3 bright stars that form his belt. 2 are almost in a straight line. The 3rd is nudged slightly off to one side. Now look back at the plateau. 2 pyramids, Khufu and Khafre, line up almost neatly along a southwest-northeast diagonal. The 3rd, Menkaure, is shifted a little to the side. The claim is that this isn't an accident of terrain or royal rivalry. It's a deliberate echo. The ground plan of Giza, people say, is the belt of Orion translated into limestone. Once you see it in a diagram, a photo of the constellation overlaid on a map of the plateau, it can feel oddly persuasive. Your pattern-seeking brain hums with satisfaction. 3 stars above, 3 pyramids below, brightest star, biggest pyramid, faintest star, smallest pyramid, a pleasing, almost storybook symmetry between heaven and earth. Add one more layer, and it becomes even more emotionally sticky. In later Egyptian religion, the god Osiris, lord of the dead and rebirth, is associated with Orion. The king in some texts is said to become an Osiris in death. If Orion is Osiris and the pyramids are gates for kings to join him, then building your royal cemetery as Orion's belt looks like the ultimate devotional gesture, as if the whole plateau is a permanent ritual, frozen mid-prayer. You can see why this theory has a grip on people. It's cinematic. It flatters the builders with almost superhuman intentionality. It offers a single elegant key that seems to unlock several mysteries at once. The layout of the plateau, the sizes of the pyramids, even their relationship to the Nile, which some diagrams happily match to the Milky Way. It also fits our modern hunger for hidden codes. The thought that the ancients left us a gigantic sky map that only becomes obvious from an aerial photo or a planetarium projection feels irresistible. But once the warm rush of recognition subsides, historians and archaeologists start asking colder questions. How tight is this match, really? How do the dates line up? And what counts as a pattern, as opposed to a coincidence that we've dressed up with meaning after the fact? On the dating front, there's a basic chronological issue. The Giza pyramids were built around 4,500 years ago in the mid-3rd millennium BCE. The identification of a specific group of stars with the god Osiris and the detailed Orion theology we know from later texts comes into clear focus centuries afterward in sources that are already looking back on the Old Kingdom. That doesn't mean the association didn't exist earlier. Religious ideas often predate the texts that record them. But it does mean we're trying to project a well-attested later symbolism straight back into an earlier, more shadowy period. We don't have an inscription from Khufu's time that says, "I, the king, have had my pyramid built as the star Alnitak." We have, instead, a silence we're tempted to fill. Then there's selectivity. If you stare at the night sky long enough, and you're allowed to pick and choose which stars matter, you can make almost any 3 points on the ground resemble some 3 points in the heavens. Critics of the Orion theory point out that the match isn't as crisp as the popular diagrams make it seem. You have to choose exactly which stars count as the belt. You have to rotate the constellation relative to true north. You have to decide how far away the map is supposed to sit from the terrain. And you are, if you're not careful, doing that, choosing after you already know where the pyramids are. It's like being handed 3 dots on a piece of paper and being told, pick a constellation that fits. If you look through enough star charts and allow some slop in your rotation and scale, you'll eventually find something that feels close. That brings us to scaling itself. When proponents of the Orion correlation place a stellar diagram over Giza, they rotate and resize the Orion pattern to make the best fit. That's reasonable. The sky is vast, the plateau is small. But this also introduces flexibility. If you can stretch and turn your model freely, you can often coax a decent alignment out of many point sets. Add another element, precession. The slow wobble of Earth's axis means that over tens of thousands of years, the apparent positions of stars at a given time of night and year drift against the background grid. Some versions of the theory argue that the best fit between Giza and Orion doesn't occur at the time the pyramids were built, but at some other favoured date many thousands of years earlier. This is where alarm bells start ringing for most Egyptologists, because it seems to demand that Old Kingdom architects were encoding a sky picture not of their present, but of some remote epoch, a kind of secret timestamp only recoverable with modern astronomical calculations. That level of precision, stretching over spans of time far greater than any Egyptian historical memory we know, is a major claim. The more spectacular the claim, the more direct evidence we'd want in its support. And that evidence simply isn't there. A more subtle concern is statistical. Imagine you're wandering through a city at night, looking at the distribution of streetlights. If you're determined to find a match to some asterism, Orion, the Big Dipper, a random triangle, you probably can. Our brains are wired to link dots. We evolved in part by seeing shapes in the dark and acting on them. So when we place a constellation on top of a map and see, wow, that's close, we have to ask, close compared to what? How often would 3 random points accidentally approximate 3 stars, somewhere in the sky? There are ways to formalize that question, to run simulations and see how special a given pattern really is. When people do that, the uniqueness of the Giza-Orion fit tends to melt. You can find similar matches with other star groupings and other monument clusters if you're open to some wiggle room. All of this doesn't mean the idea is worthless. It means that the more exact and far-reaching the claims, down to specific stars, magnitudes, precessional epochs, the shakier the ground. What remains interesting, even to cautious scholars, are the broader resonances. The Egyptians did care about Orion in some form, certainly by the time of the pyramid texts. They did tie the king's fate to stellar regions. They did build at least one pyramid complex, at Abusir, with clear solar and stellar symbolism. And they did, as we've seen, think of architecture as a bridge between earth and sky. It's entirely plausible that when a priest or court poet looked up at Orion over Giza, he smiled at the resemblance, and perhaps even preached on it. Humans are just as prone to mythologizing their constructions as we are to mythologizing the night. It's also plausible that when planners laid out the 3 Great Pyramids, they preferred an arrangement that felt balanced not only in terms of geology and visibility, but in terms of the heavenly picture above, a soft qualitative harmony rather than a rigid, coded diagram. What professional historians and archaeologists try to do in the middle of all this is develop habits of weighing such claims. First, start with what the culture itself says. Do texts, tomb decorations, ritual formulas talk about a pattern in terms that line up with the proposed theory? Second, check the engineering constraints. Does the theory require the builders to ignore obvious practical concerns, bedrock, quarries, pre-existing structures in favour of a perfect match? Or could a looser symbolic intent have coexisted with all those down-to-earth decisions? Third, examine the statistics. Is the pattern really so unlikely that we need a special explanation? Or is it the kind of resemblance you'd expect to crop up by chance now and then? Fourth, be honest about how much fine-tuning the theory needs. If you must tilt and stretch the constellation just so, cherry-pick dates, and appeal to knowledge we have no independent reason to grant the builders, you're probably leaning too hard on the pattern. When you run the Orion correlation theory through that quiet checklist, what's left is something smaller, but still gentle and evocative. We can say the night sky, including Orion, mattered deeply to Egyptian royal ideology. We can say the Giza layout has a family resemblance to that bright belt, enough that even modern eyes notice it. We can say this resemblance might have been meaningful to the people who built and used the site, whether or not it governed every surveyor's peg and cubit rod. What we cannot say, with any confidence, is that the entire plateau is a precise stone chart of Orion's belt, finely calibrated to some lost golden age, intended as a secret code waiting thousands of years for us to crack. In other words, the pattern is real at the level of metaphor and human perception. Its existence as a literal architectural blueprint remains unproven. As you lie there, imagining the three dark masses of Giza under the winter stars, you don't have to choose between wonder and skepticism. You can let Orion rise over the plateau. You can notice how the belt leans, how the pyramids lean, and feel that little internal click of recognition. At the same time, you can remember that human beings, ancient and modern, are experts at connecting dots, sometimes illuminatingly, sometimes extravagantly. In the next stretch of our story, we'll turn from Orion back to a star much closer to home. Because while the night sky offered the Egyptians a realm of imperishable lights, the daily journey of the sun was an even more relentless pattern, beating like a great golden pendulum over their land. And the kings of the Pyramid Age were just as eager to hitch their eternity to Ra's unending circuit as they were to any glittering belt of distant stars. If the stars were the cool, remote background of Egyptian afterlife hopes, the sun was the blazing headline. Every single day, without fail, it rose in the east, climbed, and dropped toward the western horizon. In the delta, it might hide behind clouds. On the Giza Plateau, it was much harder to ignore. The landscape itself is almost an instrument built for watching sunlight move. Flat horizons, dry air, a sky that seems to go on forever. Over the centuries leading up to the Pyramid Age, you can watch Egyptian religion slowly tilt toward that overwhelming presence. The sun isn't absent in the earliest layers of belief. Even before the Old Kingdom, there are hints of sun-linked deities. But it's under the kings who build the great stone pyramids that a particular solar god, Ra, begins to rise, not just in the heavens, but in ideology. The king is no longer just a lord on earth and a star among the dead. He is, increasingly, son of Ra. His very throne name is wrapped in solar symbolism. Texts talk about him sailing with the sun god in a boat across the sky, renewing the cosmos by participating in that daily journey. This is the period when the horizon itself becomes a sacred concept. The Egyptians give it a name, Akhet. It's the place where the sun appears and disappears, the liminal zone between the visible and the hidden world. On some royal monuments, the hieroglyph for horizon is literally drawn as two peaks with the sun disk rising between them. Later, the most famous pyramid of them all, Khufu's, will be called Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu. The name reads almost like an equation. Pyramid equals horizon. Horizon equals the place where Ra is reborn each dawn. Once you see that, it becomes hard not to ask whether the planners at Giza were thinking in daily, seasonal, solar rhythms as much as in static lines and angles. Unlike constellations, which require clear nights and careful watching, the path of the sun is something a farmer, a boatman, a temple priest cannot help but notice. Its points of extremity, the longest and shortest days, the highest and lowest noon arcs, stand out like knots in the year. We call those knots solstices. To Egyptians, they were simpler than any technical term. They were the times when the days around you were plainly swelling or shrinking, when the sun's rising and setting points stopped sliding along the horizon and seemed to hesitate before turning back. Did the builders of the Great Pyramids mark those hesitations in stone? Here again, the evidence is quieter than the more dramatic fringe theories. We don't find an Old Kingdom blueprint saying, "Here the causeway shall be aimed at the midwinter sunset." What we do find are suggestive patterns, and a cultural context in which those patterns make sense. Consider the pyramid causeways, the long, straight, paved roads connecting the valley temples near the Nile's edge to the mortuary temples at the foot of the pyramids. On one level, they are brutally practical. You need a controlled route to move stone, offerings and processions up from the floodplain. A straight raised causeway does that, but line up their bearings and something else creeps in. Khafra's causeway, the one linked to the middle pyramid and the Great Sphinx, runs from roughly east to west with a slight southern tilt. At Giza's latitude, the midwinter sun sets somewhat south of due west, the midsummer sun somewhat north. If you stand in the Valley Temple and look up along Khafra's causeway toward the western plateau in the right season, the setting sun's path appears to slide down toward the looming bulk of the pyramid complex, brushing close to its axis. It's not a laser-tight alignment in the modern astronomical sense, but for an eye attuned to symbolism more than millidegrees, it creates a potent image, the sun's descent and the king's monument sharing the same general arc. Khufu's causeway, by contrast, trends a little differently. Its alignment doesn't hit a single neat solstitial target. Instead, some researchers have suggested that the ensemble of Giza causeways may frame a range of solar positions, not a single magic date, but the seasonal swing itself. This is where the idea of solar logic starts to feel plausible. Rather than encoding exact astronomical conditions, this azimuth on that one day of a 26,000-year precessional cycle, the architects might have been chasing a more qualitative goal. Make the king's processional path resonate with the most dramatic moments of the sun's yearly drama. Place temples and doorways so that, as the months roll by, priests and onlookers watch the disk appear or disappear in visually meaningful ways between pylons over walls behind pyramids. We see a clearer example of this kind of thinking in later Old Kingdom architecture. At a site called Abu Sur, south of Giza, the kings of the 5th dynasty build what are unambiguously sun temples. Structures explicitly dedicated to Ra, with open courts for sun worship and obelisks symbolizing the sun's ray. Their layouts are more transparently solar than anything at Giza. Altars in direct line with the midday sun, features that catch dawn or dusk light. The fact that this overt solar cult blossoms only a few generations after Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure suggests continuity rather than a sudden invention. The soil for such temples was being prepared in the Pyramid Age, when calling yourself Son of Ra had already become a royal habit. If priests at Abu Sur worried about where sunlight fell in their courtyards at key moments, it's hard to imagine that their colleagues at Giza were totally indifferent to similar questions. Evidence from elsewhere in Egypt reinforces this impression. The great temple of Karnak at Thebes, built and rebuilt over centuries long after the Pyramid era, includes a famous axis that catches the rising sun around the winter solstice, sending a beam of light deep into the sanctuary. The alignment isn't mathematically perfect in a modern sense. The sun's disk is large enough that close works just fine, but for those standing there the message is unmissable. Patterns like this tell us two things. First, Egyptian builders were perfectly capable of noticing and using the sun's seasonal behavior in their designs. Second, they were not obsessive, clockmakers chasing fractions of degrees. A good enough alignment that delivered a powerful visual or ritual effect seems to have satisfied them. When we bring that mindset back to Giza, solar readings of the site no longer seem like Baroque overinterpretation. They look like one layer in a palimpsest of meanings: geology, visibility, royal lineage, and the great golden pendulum of the sky all tugging on the surveyor's cord. Take orientation. The pyramids are famously aligned very close to true north-south, east-west. That could be done, and probably was done, by watching stars around the pole and bisecting their paths, not by watching the sun. Stellar methods give you cleaner cardinal points. But once you have a north-south axis laid down for cosmological and practical reasons, the solar cycle automatically rides along with it. At Giza's latitude, the sun will rise and set north of due east and west in summer, and south in winter, swinging symmetrically around the cardinal line. A perfectly cardinal pyramid face becomes, incidentally, a screen for watching that swing. At certain times of year, the shadow of the pyramid's edge will fall in striking ways on nearby structures. The daily circuit of light and shade on the limestone, predictable and stable, would have been hard for temple personnel not to notice, and probably easy to weave into ritual calendars. So we don't have to choose between they oriented their pyramids to the stars and they cared about the sun. Stellar alignment gives you a rigid, practical grid. Solar symbolism plays out on that grid over time, like a moving play on a fixed stage. In that sense, solar patterns at Giza could be intentional in a loose design philosophy way, even if they fall short of the tight tolerances demanded by modern archaeoastronomers. A king's architects might have said, in effect, let the causeway lean so that in the season of low water, the setting sun drifts toward the pyramid's southern shoulder without worrying whether the azimuth is exactly 242.0 degrees. What mattered was that the path of the sun and the path of the royal procession mirrored one another symbolically, both travelling from east and life toward west and the realm of the blessed dead. That symbolic mirroring sits comfortably alongside much earthier needs. The causeway has to connect two fixed elevation points. It has to avoid awkward gullies and existing quarries. It has to line up sensibly with the valley harbour where boats docked and with the forecourts where offerings were marshalled. Surveyors could start with these constraints, then nudge their line within a small range of possibilities to give it a pleasing, seasonally resonant tilt. Practical surveying and sacred orientation are not rivals here. They're partners. The same people who measured with cubit rods and plumb bobs also recited hymns to Ra at dawn. It would be strange if one half of their lives never touched the other. If we let go of the idea that the Giza Plateau is a hyper-precise observatory, and instead imagine it as a landscape tuned to obvious recurring sky events, its mysterious pattern becomes both more modest and more believable. The pyramids point north like compasses. Their temple axes and causeways lean just enough to let the sun do something interesting at certain times of year. The king, whose name is now bound to Ra, is carried along those paths, his rituals synchronized not with a single secret date, but with the endlessly repeated rise and fall of light over the Nile Valley. As you drift with that image, the sun silting slowly westward, the long shadow of a pyramid pouring across the sand, you can feel how the Egyptians might have experienced their monuments, as solid, immovable shapes woven into a moving fabric of time. In the next turn of our story, we'll leave the blazing sky for something quieter, but no less powerful. The world of numbers, measures and records, where patterns are carved not in stone or light, but in the very way a civilization thinks. If the sun gave Egyptian monuments their drama, numbers gave them their rhythm. Any structure on the scale of the Great Pyramids isn't just a feat of stone. It's a feat of counting. To stack millions of blocks into a coherent shape, you need more than inspiration. You need a shared agreement about what straight means, what level means, what this long means. You need rules that can be taught to hundreds of work crews, repeated day after day, season after season, without the whole thing slowly drifting into chaos. In other words, you need an administrative mind. By the time Khufu begins his pyramid at Giza, that mind is already well developed. Egypt didn't wake up one morning and decide to build a perfect, cardinally aligned stone mountain on bedrock. Before Giza, there are earlier pyramids, some experiments, some partial disasters that show the learning curve. Stepped pyramids, bent slopes, adjustments in mid-construction. Each attempt is also a lesson in management. Somewhere along that curve, the Egyptians tighten their grip on measurement. We know they used a standard unit, the royal cubit, divided into smaller parts. We find cubit rods in later tombs, carefully marked sticks, each segment incised, the way a modern ruler is ticked with millimeters. Even if the precise length of the royal cubit changed slightly over centuries, within any given project it had to be stable. The whole geometry of the pyramid, its base, its height, its internal passages, is expressed in multiples of that unit. A foreman can't stand on every corner at once, but he can say, lay out 440 cubits on each side, mark the diagonals, check that they match. If they do, the base is square. If they don't, adjust. Once the base is fixed, every course above can be planned as a slightly smaller rectangle, shrunk by a known amount. That shrinking is where pattern becomes almost automatic. Imagine a design office in the palace or on the site, where a small group of specialist architects draw out the ideal pyramid in numbers rather than on parchment. The first course, so many cubits in from the base. The second, another standard offset. Each layer a module that can be written down or memorized. You don't need to understand the full design to be useful. You just need to know your part of the pattern. Teams of stonemasons can be told, for this band of courses we are cutting blocks to these dimensions with this standard angle on the face. Quarries can be told, we need so many of that block type per week. Haulage crews, this many sledges, this many loads per day. When you divide a gigantic project into repeatable tasks like that, a very specific kind of pattern emerges. Not mystical, not cosmic, but bureaucratic. We see traces of it in the archaeology, just south of the Giza pyramids. There's a site often called the Workers' Village, or the Pyramid Town. Excavations there have revealed long barracks-like galleries, bakeries that could produce bread in truly industrial quantities, evidence of cattle being butchered by the hundred. The picture isn't of slaves dragged from conquered lands. It's of organized labor. Scribes leave their own kind of fossil. On the insides of blocks, on underside faces that would later be hidden, we find red ink marks, short notes, numbers, crew names, gang designations like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkora, orientation marks with little arrows and fractions of cubits. These aren't ceremonial inscriptions, they're work labels. A stone might be tagged with its intended course number, its position in a row, the team responsible for placing it. In a world without barcodes, red ochre and a quick brush stroke become the tracking system. Tool marks tell a similar story. When archaeologists examine the limestone faces of core blocks or casing stones, they find consistent chisel patterns, repeated rhythms of blows, the same widths of cutting edge. It suggests teams trained to use particular tools in particular ways, producing standardized surfaces that would mate cleanly with their neighbors. On the plateau itself, there are subtle signatures of modular thinking. The courses of Khufu's pyramid, for example, seem to come in families, sequences of layers where block sizes and joint patterns repeat, then change to a new family for the next band. This kind of repetition is exactly what you would expect if a project manager was parceling out chunks of the pyramid to different squads. Your gang is responsible for courses 20 through 30 using this module. When you're done, another team will take over with the next module. Once you accept that, some of the site's regularities look less like secret messages to the gods and more like clever ways to keep thousands of workers marching in step. Quotas fit into this picture naturally. If you have a short, predictable flood season when boats can bring heavy stone from upstream, and a long, dry season when only local quarries are practical, you plan different quotas for each phase. You decide how many blocks of each size must be in place by the start of the next inundation. To hit those numbers, you break them down, per month, per week, per day. Each work gang is given a target. The targets themselves become a kind of invisible pattern. If the daily quota for a crew is, say, 20 blocks for course 35, placed to a tolerance of a finger's width, then the builder's habits will carve that standard into the monument. In a way, the real mysterious pattern is the fact that so many courses are so even, so regular, for so long. The bureaucratic mind doesn't only show up in stone. It also peeks out from papyri and later records. From slightly later periods in Egyptian history, we have textual evidence of how state projects were run, scribes recording deliveries of grain and beer to work crews, lists of workers absent or sick, tallies of stone blocks moved from one location to another. While we don't possess a complete set of such records for the construction of the Great Pyramids, the administrative machinery described in those documents almost certainly had its roots in the Old Kingdom. There are scraps of Old Kingdom papyri from other sites that sound very familiar, allocations of rations for the gang of the Pyramid of so and so, entries that suggest fixed duty rotations, perhaps even seasonal drafts of farmers during the flood months, when their fields were underwater and they could be redirected to work on royal projects. Layer that kind of system over Giza, and it's easy to see how consistent designs arise. If each new royal pyramid taps into roughly the same administrative toolbox, the same measuring rods, the same training schools for scribes and surveyors, the same ideas about how many men a gang should have, how far they can move stone in a day, then the monuments will naturally resemble one another in ways that feel deliberate. Base lengths end up in familiar ranges. Slopes converge on angles that masons are used to cutting. The spacing between key elements in the complex, the valley temple, the causeway, the mortuary temple, falls into distances that match known chord lengths and convenient marching times. Stand back centuries later, and those regularities can look like a code. Did they choose that particular pyramid slope because it expressed a sacred ratio? Maybe. Did they also choose it because their prefabricated measuring routines and rule-of-thumb techniques made that angle easier to reproduce on a huge scale without catastrophic error? Very likely. The two explanations don't cancel each other out. A religious symbol that also fits the spreadsheet is ideal. But there is a limit to how much of this pattern we can reconstruct. The ancient office where the master plan of Khufu's pyramid was stored, the scrolls, the reference rods, the clay ceilings on chests of documents, all of that is gone. We have no surviving pyramid project manual, no neat chapter titled Section 4, Standardized Block Modules and Daily Quotas. What we do have are fragments, measurements of the finished monuments, tool marks, stray inscriptions, the layout of worker housing, the later bureaucratic texts that echo earlier practices. From these, archaeologists and historians build models, plausible systems of management that could have produced what we see. At that point, inference begins. When someone claims that the base length, height, and slope of the Great Pyramid encode a perfect set of mathematical constants, it's worth asking, is this a pattern the builders needed to know, or a pattern that appears because of the practical choices they made? Did they aim at a transcendental ratio, or did they aim at a manageable angle that happens to brush against a number we find interesting? Likely the truth lives in a grey zone. Egyptian surveyors clearly had a sophisticated sense of proportion. Their fractions, their unit systems, their ability to lay out right angles and equal lengths across large distances show that. But they also lived in a messy world of imperfect stone, weary labourers and fluctuating Nile floods. Their bureaucracy wasn't a computer, it was people with ink and memory, trying to keep a vast machine humming. So when you stare at the pattern of Giza, the matched orientations, the similar slopes, the repeated layout of temples and causeways, it can be soothing to remember that not every line is a whisper from the cosmos. Many of them are the quiet handwriting of administrators, repeated enough times to harden into stone. In the next part of our story, we'll watch those administrative habits echo forward in time as later kings imitate, tweak, or deliberately outdo their predecessors, weaving new layers into the pattern on the plateau. Patterns don't just sit still in one reign, they ripple. Once Khufu has stamped his shape onto the Giza plateau, every later king who dreams of a pyramid is, in some sense, reacting to that decision, copying it, arguing with it, or quietly trying to fix its problems. But to see what's really going on, you have to zoom out in time. Giza isn't the beginning of the story. It's a middle chapter in a much longer experiment. If you go back a little earlier to the reign of Djoser at Saqqara, the pattern looks much rougher, but you can already feel the outline. Djoser's monument starts as a simple mastaba, basically a big rectangular bench of stone. Then, during construction, it grows. One step added over another, the base expanded, the design revised. The final result is the famous step pyramid, a stack of 6 steps rising over an enormous underground complex. Here the pyramid pattern is still emerging from older traditions. The complex already has elements that will become standard: enclosure walls, courtyards, dummy chapels, a clear relationship between tomb and temple. Orientation to the cardinal directions is already there, though not with the laser-like precision of Giza. You can see the surveyors learning on the job. A little later, under Sneferu, that experimentation goes into overdrive. Sneferu builds not one, but at least 3 major pyramids, at Maidum, at Darshaw's Bent Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid. It's as if he's running a royal research program in stone. The Maidum Pyramid seems to start as a step pyramid, then is converted to a true, smooth-sided pyramid by filling in the steps. At some point, perhaps during or after construction, the outer layers collapse. Today it looks like a strange, broken tower surrounded by a skirt of rubble. At Darshur, the bent pyramid begins at a very steep angle. Midway up, the builders change their minds or their calculations. The slope suddenly flattens, giving the pyramid its kinked profile. Crack monitors carved into the stone and reinforcement works suggest they were worried about structural failure. By the time they build the Red Pyramid, they've learnt their lesson. The slope is gentler, the structure is stable, the internal passages are arranged more cautiously. Orientation to the cardinal points is good, though still not as perfect as Khufu will manage. If you line up these projects in your mind, a picture emerges. The Egyptians are homing in on a recipe: cardinal orientation, smooth sides, stable slope, internal chambers placed so the whole mass of stone supports itself instead of trying to tear itself apart. Giza, in that light, doesn't appear from nowhere. It's the confident phase of a design curve that started with false starts and near disasters. Now look the other way in time, forward from Khufu and his neighbours. Later kings absolutely imitate Giza. They also quietly break from it. Khafre, the builder of the second pyramid at Giza, clearly wants to tie himself to Khufu's success. His pyramid sits on slightly higher ground, so from some angles it looks taller, even though it's actually smaller. Its slope is similar. It aligns to the same cardinal scheme. Its complex includes a valley temple, a mortuary temple, a causeway, core ingredients of the Giza template. That's imitation as legitimacy. By echoing Khufu's layout, Khafre isn't just making a practical choice. He's telling everyone who sees the plateau, I am part of this line. My power comes from the same source. My pyramid joins and subtly competes with the great one next door. Menkaure, the third king at Giza, does something interesting. His pyramid is smaller, significantly so, but its casing draws attention. The lower courses are clad in dark granite instead of white limestone. Size is one kind of statement, material contrast is another. You can read this as a correction or a recalibration. Maybe resources are tighter, maybe the focus is shifting from sheer volume to quality and finish. Either way, he's still plugged into the pattern aligned with his predecessors, using the same basic components, but he's modulating it. Move to other sites, and the echoes become more complicated. At Abusir, a little north of Saqqara, 5th dynasty pyramids are unmistakably descendants of Giza in concept. Square bases, cardinal orientations, causeways, valley temples. Yet they are smaller, less precise, built with more rubble core and less fine stone. The finishing quality drops, the angle of slope changes. At Saqqara itself, later kings placed their pyramids in relation to older monuments, often reusing the necropolis, weaving new complexes into a crowded sacred landscape. The basic grammar, pyramid, temple, causeway, remains, but local topography and earlier structures force variations in alignment and spacing. These variations matter for pattern hunters. If someone claims that a very specific angle at Giza encodes a single cosmic or mathematical secret, the question is, why doesn't every later pyramid use that exact angle too? Sometimes they do reuse a favoured slope. Sneferu's Red Pyramid and Khufu's Great Pyramid are very close in angle, which might indicate a practical sweet spot that engineers trust. But across dynasties and sites, there is real diversity. Flatter slopes, steeper ones, compromises dictated by geology or ambition. You see a similar push and pull with orientation. Cardinal alignment is a strong tradition. From Djoser onward, most royal pyramids are oriented broadly north, south, east, west. But the accuracy varies. Some complexes skew slightly, sometimes likely due to local constraints or different surveying methods. At some later sites, the topography of the desert edge and the course of the Nile twist the layout. This is where cross-site comparison becomes a kind of reality check. If a proposed mysterious pattern claims that every pyramid of Egypt is coordinated into a single grand design, all pointing to one star or one longitude or one global grid line, the actual data get in the way. Pyramids cluster around Memphis, Saqqara, Dahshur, Giza, Abusir, because that's where the Old Kingdom power center is. Their orientations generally chase true north, not some exotic azimuth, because that's what the cult of the king and the state religion demand, an ordered cosmos mirrored on Earth. Within that framework, individual reigns improvise. One king might stretch his causeway longer, bending it to cross an older wadi. Another might rotate his valley temple slightly to meet the changing Nile bank. A third might shrink his pyramid, but elaborate the reliefs in his mortuary temple instead, shifting investment from mass to meaning. Imitation is always selective. A new king wants to look orthodox enough to be legitimate. I am like Khufu. I'm like Djoser. I, too, command stone and sky, but different enough to be memorable. Different enough that when people stand in the shadow of his pyramid, they know whose time they are in. And mistakes don't vanish from memory. When earlier structures develop cracks, subside, or show signs of stress, later builders quietly adjust. They thicken core walls, they shift chamber positions lower in the body of the pyramid. They tame over ambitious slopes in some cases. That prudence is visible. The bent pyramid's mid-course angle change is like an architectural scar, a reminder written on the horizon. Be careful. The more cautious Red Pyramid and Great Pyramid can be read as responses to that warning. So, across dynasties, you get a pattern that's part tradition, part feedback loop. Successful solutions, cardinal orientation, stable slopes, standard units are reused. Failures, collapsing casings, oversteep profiles, unstable subsoil are quietly retired. Meanwhile, political needs, religious fashions, and economic realities push each new project to tweak the formula. The result is not a single flawless code, but a family of related designs. Giza sits in that family as a particularly crisp expression of one moment's consensus. The right way to align a royal tomb, the right relationship between pyramid and temples, the right scale to impress subjects and please the gods. Is it unique? In some ways, yes. The sheer concentration of 3 huge pyramids and their associated complexes on one plateau, so cleanly aligned and carefully planned, doesn't really repeat. But is it part of a system? Also, yes. That system is the evolving tradition of royal funerary architecture in Egypt, a centuries-long conversation in stone between kings, priests, engineers, and the landscape they all inhabit. When you compare Giza with Meidum and Dahshur, with Saqqara and Abusir, the supposed absolute mystery softens into something more human. You see ambition, rivalry, respect, anxiety, memory. One king tracing the footprint of another, because to stand in that lineage is to claim cosmic backing. Another nudging his axis a few degrees, or shifting his emphasis from height to decoration, as if to say, I obey the pattern, but I also improve it. And that means when we look for patterns at Giza, we have to decide which level we're talking about. There's the broad pattern of Egyptian royal tombs, cardinally aligned, desert edge pyramids paired with temples and causeways. There's the more specific pattern of Old Kingdom Memphis with its cluster of necropolises. There's the local pattern on the Giza Plateau itself, where 3 neighbouring kings negotiate visibility, hierarchy and harmony. Each level tells a slightly different story. In the next part of our journey we'll step even farther back, not through time, but across the map, to see how modern surveys and satellite views can both reveal real alignments and tempt us into seeing perfect lines that were never actually there. When you zoom all the way out, past Giza, past Memphis, past Egypt itself, you enter a very modern kind of desert. The desert of maps. Today, instead of walking the plateau with a measuring rope, you can open an app, drop a pin on Khufu's pyramid, draw a line across the globe, and see where it lands. Another pin, another line, another screenshot. Rotate, zoom, overlay different layers. It feels like flying. It also feels very precise. Satellite imagery gives you the illusion of standing outside the world, watching everything from nowhere. Distances snap into numbers. Angles show up to decimal places. If 2 monuments line up on your screen, it's tempting to think they were meant to. That's the first quiet trap. The original builders never saw the Earth that way. Their horizon was local, the desert edge, the Nile, the circumpolar stars wheeling overhead. Their reference frame was curved, lived, and imperfect. Ours is flattened. Every global map you've ever seen is a kind of lie. To turn a round planet into a flat picture, you have to stretch something areas, shapes, angles, or distances. Cartographers call this projection. The most famous one, the Mercator projection, keeps local angles accurate but wildly distorts size. Greenland looks enormous. Africa shrinks. A straight line on that map, called a rum line, keeps a constant compass bearing, which is nice for sailors, but it's not the shortest path on the globe. The true shortest path bends following a great circle. If you draw a mystical line on a map that uses one projection, you might get a very different story than if you draw it on another. Yet on the screen it all looks clean and decisive, straight segments cutting across continents, connecting Giza to Machu Picchu to Angkor Wat, each new waypoint crowed as another hit. Underneath, there are layers of assumption, projection choice, map center, the exact points you tap, the resolution of the imagery, tiny differences in input that can shift your line by kilometers over long distances. Scale is another quiet player. If you print a map of Egypt on a sheet of paper and draw a line that passes within, say, a millimeter of 3 sites, it feels uncanny. But on the ground, that millimeter might represent hundreds of meters or more. A line that looks razor perfect in your notebook could be wandering past pyramids, villages, and empty desert, in a fuzzy corridor a kilometer wide. Our eyes are not good at intuitively scaling from the page to the planet. They're even worse at intuitively handling error. Every measurement you make of a pyramid's center, of its angle, of its latitude, has some uncertainty baked in. Ancient surveyors working with chords and sighting tools did incredibly well, but not infinitely well. Modern measurements improve on them, but still come with margins of error, especially when different teams at different times use different methods. If you claim that one pyramid lines up with another to the meter across hundreds or thousands of kilometers, you're already stretching beyond what the data can honestly support. It's like trying to aim a laser pointer at a coin on the moon and then declaring victory because the beam hit the right crater. Then there's the human brain, which might be the trickiest map of all. We are pattern-finding machines, survival-favoured ancestors who could see tracks in the sand, a faint trail of berries in the undergrowth, the hint of a face in shadows. The cost of a false positive, seeing a pattern that isn't there, is often low. The cost of a false negative, missing the leopard in the tall grass, can be fatal, so your brain is biased toward connection. Give it a starry sky, it makes constellations. Give it a global map sprinkled with ancient sites, it makes alignments, grids, and messages. Psychologists have names for parts of this. Selection bias. You notice, remember, and share the hits, and quietly ignore the misses. If your line happens to pass near 3 impressive monuments, you talk about those 3 and leave out the dozens of places where it passes over nothing in particular. Multiple comparisons, the more possible lines, angles, and site combinations you look at, the more amazing patterns you will find just by chance. If you draw enough lines between enough points on any busy map, some of them will come close to something famous. In statistics, when you ask whether something is significant, you ask a simple question in disguise. How likely is this pattern if there's actually no underlying plan? If you flip a coin 10 times and get 7 heads, you might raise an eyebrow. Do it once. It's noise. Do it every time with the same coin. Something's up. With pyramids and maps, you can ask a similar question. If there were no global design, if pyramid sites were chosen only for local reasons, geology, politics, religion, how often would lines drawn between them line up within a certain distance just by accident? This is where wonder gets a little humbler and a little clearer. A responsible approach doesn't say, there are no patterns. It says, let's test which patterns are stronger than we'd expect from randomness alone. For sleepy late-night map voyages, you don't need heavy math, just a calm checklist in your mind. First, what exactly is being aligned? Is it the center of each pyramid? A corner? A temple doorway? If the definition keeps changing, center here, edge there, a nearby hill somewhere else, that's a warning sign. Real planning tends to use consistent reference points. Second, how tight is the claimed alignment in real units? Not it looks straight on the screen, but these points all fall within X meters of a best fit line over Y kilometers. A line that wanders within a 10-kilometer corridor across half the Earth is not evidence of millimeter-perfect ancient surveying. It's a broadband. Third, how many chances did we give ourselves to find something? Did we start with Giza and one specific other site for a clear historical reason? Or did we try dozens of combinations until something looked cool? The more we search, the more a hit becomes expected instead of extraordinary. Fourth, does the pattern match what we already know from history and archaeology? If an alignment claim requires Old Kingdom Egyptians to have detailed knowledge of distant lands they never contacted, or to value a direction their own texts never mention, it's asking you to accept extra miracles. Sometimes new evidence overturns old assumptions, but extraordinary stories need more than a single line on Google Earth to stand. Fifth, what happens when we add more data? If your magical line only works when you include 3 sites and break down as soon as you add 4, 5, 6 more pyramids from the same period, that's telling you something. Strong patterns usually get stronger as the dataset grows. Weak ones crumble. This kind of checklist doesn't have to drain the enchantment. In a way, it deepens it. Because when an alignment survives those gentle tests, what remains is sturdier. The cardinal orientation of Giza. The way the 3 main pyramids on the plateau are arranged along the edge, stepping down in size and elevation. The consistent pairing of pyramid, temple and causeway along the desert margin. Those are not artifacts of projection or lucky lines on a warped rectangle of paper. They're the result of people walking the ground, watching the stars, arguing over plans, and pounding survey stakes into real sand. Modern maps can help us see those choices more clearly. Satellite imagery reveals how valley temples meet the ancient floodplain, how causeways rise out of wadis, how clusters of pyramids hug the desert escarpment like beads on a string. The same tools used carelessly can tempt us into chasing patterns that live only in the flat glow of the screen. So when you find yourself tracing lines from Giza across the world, you can let both reactions breathe. The childlike thrill, what if this means something? And the patient voice, how would we know wonder and rigour aren't enemies here? They're partners. One asks the question, the other keeps asking follow-ups. And if we let them work together, the patterns that remain at the end of the night may be fewer and quieter than the grand global grids some imagine, but they will be ours in a deeper way, harder to dismiss, closer to how the builders themselves might have understood their work, not as a flawless cosmic code wrapped around the Earth, but as a carefully ordered world carved into one corner of it. In the next step of our journey, we'll leave the lines on the map and slip back inside the stone itself, into places we can't yet fully see, hidden chambers, subtle anomalies in the rock, where new scans are beginning to hint that even within these familiar shapes, the story still isn't finished. When you step back inside the stone, the first thing to remember is that for most of history, almost everything we knew about the Great Pyramids came from what the eye could see and the hand could touch. Corridors you could walk down, chambers you could stand in, masonry you could measure with a string. The rest was guesswork. In the last few decades, that balance has started to tilt. We're no longer limited to what a torch reveals. We can listen to the rock. We can feel its density, its temperature, its response to tiny particles raining from space. The pyramids haven't changed. Our ways of asking questions have. Some of the new tools sound almost like magic. Muon tomography, for instance, uses cosmic rays, high-energy particles that are constantly streaming through the atmosphere. When they hit the upper air, they break apart into showers of secondary particles, including muons that keep going right through us, through buildings, through mountains, through pyramids. Muons pass more easily through empty space than through dense stone. If you place sensitive detectors in known chambers and count how many muons arrive from each direction, you can build up a ghostly picture of what lies beyond the walls. Regions where more muons slip through may indicate voids. Fewer muons suggest solid stone. It's like taking an X-ray of a monument the size of a small mountain without cracking a single block. Thermal imaging does something similar from the outside. On cool nights and warm mornings, different parts of the pyramid surface heat and cool at different rates. A thin shell over a hollow space will radiate heat differently than a thick mass of solid masonry. Sensitive infrared cameras can pick up those tiny variations. Microgravity surveys measure slight differences in the pull of Earth's gravity caused by denser or less dense regions underfoot. Ground-penetrating radar sends radio waves into the subsurface and listens for reflections from changes in material. Each method has its own strengths, weaknesses, and sources of noise. None of them give you a crisp blueprint. They give hints, anomalies, places where reality doesn't quite match your existing model. And that's where interpretation comes in. In 2017, a team working on the Scan Pyramids project announced that they had detected a large void above the Grand Gallery in Khufu's pyramid. The muon data showed an excess of particles coming through a region that, according to traditional architectural reconstructions, ought to be solid stone. It was hard not to feel a thrill. The headlines called it a hidden chamber, a secret room, a great discovery. The careful papers used calmer language, a big void, an unknown cavity, a significant anomaly. Even within the scientific team, there were different ideas about what it meant. Maybe it is an undiscovered corridor, part of a construction ramp system, now sealed off. Maybe it's a relieving space, a kind of internal buffer to redistribute weight above the Grand Gallery. Maybe it's something more elaborate, an intentional feature of the original design, with a ritual or symbolic purpose we no longer understand. The data alone doesn't tell you. It just tells you that something is there. And this is where pattern theories start quietly leaning in. If you believe that the pyramid's internal structure encodes intricate astronomical or numerological schemes, every new void feels like a missing piece of a coded message. A secret chamber above the Grand Gallery might be the key to a star map, or the final step in a ritual pathway, or a locked vault for some lost library of texts. If you see the pyramid primarily as a piece of large-scale engineering adapted over time as construction progressed, a hidden void looks like something more pragmatic, a structural solution, a byproduct of how they moved stone and adjusted plans as they went. New scans don't just change what we know, they change which stories feel more likely. What kinds of discoveries would actually strengthen the idea that a grand, precise pattern was driving the design? One would be repeated internal templates. If we found, in multiple pyramids from the same period, an identical hidden layout, say, a particular arrangement of relieving chambers, angled passages, and voids, all placed according to the same geometric rule, that would be powerful. Especially if those internal features line up systematically with external ones, shaft directions, temple axes, or specific stellar targets. Another would be clear planning marks, not just hasty red guidelines on a block, but detailed construction diagrams, painted or carved inside casing blocks or on the bedrock, showing intended positions, angles, and reference stars. A blueprint behind the stone. If such marks repeated from pyramid to pyramid, with the same ratios or the same set of angles, that would bolster the case for a tightly coordinated master scheme. A third would be synchrony. Evidence that multiple pyramid sites were being planned together, not just one after another in historical sequence. If future excavations at, say, Dashur, Abusir, and Giza turned up administrative texts or survey markers referring to a single overarching project, shared baselines, shared celestial reference points, shared canonical distances that would make large-scale patterning more plausible. On the other side, there are kinds of discoveries that quietly lean against the more ambitious pattern claims. If scans and careful internal mapping reveal that each pyramid is more of a one-off, full of adjustments, corrections, abandoned corridors, and irregular voids that don't match any elegant scheme, that supports a picture of iterative problem solving rather than hidden geometry. If we find construction ramps, workmen's galleries, and hoist chambers occupying places that some theories assign to symbolic voids, that shifts meaning from message to machinery. If more planning marks show up, but they vary widely, different measurement baselines, ad hoc angle choices, altered plans scribbled over earlier ones, that suggests masters adapting designs on the fly, not obeying a single timeless formula. And then there's the broader landscape. New surveys of the desert surface, using LiDAR and high-resolution satellite data, might reveal low, eroded foundations of additional structures connected to the pyramids, lost satellite pyramids, shrines, causeway extensions, or boundary markers. If those newly mapped features all fall neatly into an existing pattern, aligning in consistent ways with the cardinal directions, with particular stars, or with each other across sites, that would make the patterned landscape idea more robust. If instead, they mostly confirm what we already see, a general tendency to hug the desert edge, to point causeways toward the valley, to orient roughly to the cardinal directions, but with lots of local variation, then the big global or hyper-precise alignments look less necessary. Between these poles, pattern strengthened, pattern softened, most actual discoveries will land in a fuzzier middle. A new cavity here, a patch of strange masonry there. A cluster of tombs aligned more or less like we'd expect, but with a few oddballs that don't fit neatly. Gaps like that are where speculation thrives. You can feel why. A perfectly understood monument leaves little room for imagination. Every block tagged, every corridor explained, every ritual reconstructed. It becomes a solved puzzle. The pyramids are not solved. There are sealed blocks no one has moved, shafts too narrow for a person, explored only by tiny robots, voids that show up on muon charts but remain, for now, unreachable. The temptation is to fill those spaces with certainty. To say, this must be a secret archive, or this must be the missing initiatory chamber, or this proves the builders encoded a global star map. There is another way to use those gaps. You can treat them as open questions that help you sort possibilities rather than close them. Imagine a hidden void is confirmed above the Grand Gallery, and through tiny access tunnels or fiber optic cameras, archaeologists find nothing inside but rough, undecorated stone. No sarcophagus, no inscriptions, no treasure, perhaps a few stray chips from quarry work that would nudge us towards structural explanations. It doesn't kill ritual, meaning empty spaces can be symbolic too, but it weakens theories that rely on secret caches of objects or texts to complete a pattern. Now imagine a different outcome. Suppose one of the tiny shafts branching from a known chamber opens into a small room with carefully smoothed walls. On those walls, red survey lines, grid marks, perhaps lists of numbers or star names. A workroom frozen in time, where architects checked calculations or set out angles. That would be extraordinary, but not in the sensational way of hidden gold. It would give us a window into how they thought, how they organized measurements, whether they used simple fractions, complex ratios, or something in between. Whether they mentioned specific stars we already suspect they cared about. Find that in one pyramid, it's a marvel. Find variations of it in 3 or 4, and suddenly we're not just talking about pattern in the vague sense, but about specific procedures we can trace across generations. Future questions cluster around things like this. Were there standardized planning hubs on the plateau, central markers from which all later measurements radiated? Or did each pyramid define its own local grid? Do additional still-buried temples or boundary stellae exist along the desert edge, completing processional routes we only see parts of today? Can careful sequencing of construction layers, using micro-debris, tool marks, and radiocarbon dates from mortar, tell us whether builders stuck to a fixed plan or changed course halfway through? None of these questions require a hidden global code. They're smaller, humbler, but they touch the same themes: order, intention, repetition. As new scans accumulate, there's a danger of swinging too far in the opposite direction of the old mysteries, treating every anomaly as trivial unless it fits a tidy engineering explanation. That's its own kind of premature certainty. Some internal spaces might be both structural and symbolic. Some patterns might be looser than a mathematician would like, but tighter than randomness would give by default. A sleep-friendly way to hold all this is to imagine lying on the cool floor of a chamber deep inside the pyramid, feeling the weight of stone above you that no one has seen in 4,500 years. You know there are places beyond the walls your eyes will never reach. You know that beams of invisible particles are passing through that stone, telling distant detectors subtle stories about density and void. You know that somewhere on the surface, under the desert crust, there may be low foundations of shrines and markers that would make some lines on our maps look a little less mysterious, and others a little more. And you also know this: whatever we find, the basic work will be the same. Comparing, testing, asking whether a new cavity, a new staircase, a new cluster of post holes fits better with a vision of the pyramids as infinitely encoded cosmic diagrams, or as very human projects carried out under constraints of time, labour, politics, and belief. Future discoveries may tighten some patterns and loosen others. They may elevate a few alignments from curiosity to evidence, and quietly demote others from revelation to coincidence. They will almost certainly not give us a single decisive moment where a wall slides back and a perfect explanation shines out. Instead, piece by piece, they'll thicken the story, adding small corrections to angles we thought we knew, revealing that this shaft is a little higher, that casing face a little more bowed, this corner block a little more carefully trimmed than the theory required. And as those details accumulate, something gentle happens. The mysterious pattern stops being a rigid, all-or-nothing code and starts to look more like what it probably always was: a set of guiding ideas about kingship, about the sun, about the north, about the eternal stars, translated into stone by teams of architects and workers who did their best, made adjustments, and sometimes improvised. In the next part of our journey we'll gather all these threads, stars and slopes, maps and muons, corridors and causeways, and see what kind of pattern remains when we let both wonder and evidence have their say. If you let all of this settle for a moment, what actually survives as a pattern you can lean on, without squinting, without forcing the data into a shape it doesn't quite have? Start with the quietest, strongest thing: direction. Across the Old Kingdom, from the early experiments at Meidum and Darshore to the Great Plateau at Giza and beyond, the pyramids show a clear, repeated commitment to the cardinal points: north, south, east, west. Not perfect to the arc-second, not always identically executed, but unmistakably there. Whatever else might be layered on top, the builders wanted these mountains of stone to be tied to the basic frame of the world, to the path of the sun along the east-west line, to the turning of the sky around the north, to the great, slow wheel of night and day, season and season. That, more than anything, is the core of the mysterious pattern. The second piece is that a pyramid is never just the pyramid. Over and over you see a template unfolding on the desert edge, a pyramid on the higher ground, a valley temple down by the old floodplain, a long rising causeway linking the two, often a mortuary temple tight against the pyramid's base. Sometimes satellite pyramids, boat pits offering chapels, field after field of mastabas for elite burials, all oriented with a family resemblance. The exact arrangement varies, but the grammar is stable. Valley, causeway, pyramid, associated temples, a processional route from the river world of the living to the dry, elevated realm of eternity. You don't need hidden constants or secret star maps to see that. It's there in the footprints of the walls, in the way the complexes echo each other from dynasty to dynasty. A repeated sentence, spoken with a slightly different accent each reign. If you hold just those two things, cardinal orientation and the complex template, you already have a pattern that is both mysterious and very human. A repeated way of saying, here is the king set into the order of the cosmos, connected to his people, lifted out of the floodplain, tied to the turning sky. Once you see that as the foundation, the rest starts to fall into place as layers rather than as a single, all-controlling code. At the base there are practical constraints. The geology of the plateau, the need for solid bedrock under the heaviest courses, access to quarries, to labour, to the Nile, the slope angles that your masons can actually maintain up to 140 metres without collapse. The logistics of moving tens of thousands of people and millions of blocks for 20 years or more. Those things impose their own pattern. You build where the rock is good. You orient in ways your survey methods can handle. You adjust slopes when the first version cracks, as at the bent pyramid. You reuse successful layouts because they have already been debugged at full scale. On top of that sits religious symbolism, the king as Ra's son, rising and setting with the sun. The pyramid as mound of creation, echoing the first hill that emerged from the primordial waters. The western horizon as the land of the dead. The imperishable stars near the north celestial pole as the realm of the unending, where the king's bar might join the undying lights. Those ideas encourage you to tie the monument to sunrise and sunset, to the west bank of the Nile, to the eternal north, to cycles and directions that feel charged with meaning. They give extra weight to orientations that are already practical, like true north, and to layouts that connect river and desert, east and west. And then there is tradition. By the time Khufu is planning his pyramid, he isn't inventing in a vacuum. He has Sneferu's work at Dashur to look at. The layouts, the mistakes, the successes are all part of his architectural inheritance. Later kings will, in turn, look to Giza, to copy, to compete, to correct. This conservatism creates a pattern simply because what was done before becomes a kind of quiet law. You keep pointing pyramids to the cardinal points not because you derive the astronomy from scratch every time, but because that is how a proper pyramid faces. You keep building valley temples and causeways, because that is how a royal funerary complex is supposed to unfold. Practical constraints, religious symbolism, tradition. None of them has to erase the others. They stack. A causeway might run on a certain azimuth, because that's where the valley floor and the plateau line up. It might then be interpreted after the fact as echoing the winter solstice sunrise. The next king's architects might deliberately tweak their causeway angle a little closer to that solar event, because now it's become part of the story. Intentions can accrete like that. A design that began in geology and convenience gathers myth as it goes. When you turn back to the more speculative patterns with this layered view in mind, they look a little different. The star alignment theories, the Orion belt on the ground, precise targetings of Sirius or specific circumpolar stars sit on the symbolic layer. The Egyptians did care about these stars. Their texts and ceilings say so. Some shafts in the Great Pyramid really do seem to point roughly toward important stellar regions, as they would have been in the 3rd millennium BCE. But the key word is roughly. Angles are close, but not perfect. Target stars precess over centuries, dating uncertainties blur the fit. Alternative targets can be proposed for the same line. It all starts to look less like a master key and more like a field of possibilities. The numerological claims too, the golden ratio pi in the base and height, hidden constants carried out to several decimal places, become softer when you place them against what we know of Old Kingdom mathematics. Egyptians were capable surveyors. They used rational fractions, slopes expressed as sect, simple geometric rules. They did not, as far as any surviving text shows, treat pi or phi as abstract constants in the modern sense. That doesn't mean that certain pleasing proportions never arose. If you build enough right-angled structures with integer-based slopes and whole number cubit counts, some of them will land near our beloved constants by chance. Later minds, including ours, are very good at noticing those near misses and reading intention backward into them. So you end up with a spectrum. At one end, patterns that are almost certainly real and intentional, cardinal alignment, the general form of the pyramid complex, the orientation to the river and the west. In the middle, patterns that are plausible but hard to tie firmly to the builder's own words, certain alignments to bright stars, certain relationships between slopes and solar paths. At the far end, patterns that are probably more about our pattern-seeking brains than about Old Kingdom surveyors, exact encodings of modern constants, pan-global grids, messages for civilizations thousands of years in the future. The important thing lying here at the edge of sleep is that these categories don't need to fight. You can let them coexist in a gentle hierarchy of confidence. You can know, with some comfort, that the Great Pyramids are part of a deliberate landscape, oriented to the basic framework of earth and sky, structured by a template of valley and causeway and tomb. You can suspect that some alignments to stars and solstices were noticed and cherished by the builders, even if we can't reconstruct every detail. You can enjoy more speculative ideas as stories, as thought experiments, without having to accept them as fact. And you can remember that a monument this large, made by so many hands over so many years, rarely has a single, simple purpose. A passageway can be both a line of structural weakness to be managed and a path for the king's soul. A void can be both a relieving space for weight and a deliberate emptiness inscribed with meaning. A causeway can be the most practical way up from the valley, an array of stone along which a ritual moves. Multiple intentions overlapping in stone, practical, sacred, inherited, improvised. As you drift, you might let a final question float up with you. If some future civilization were to find the quiet patterns in the cities we leave behind, our grids and skylines, our roads and towers, what meanings would they see? Which of their mysterious patterns would be real, and which would be dreams laid gently over concrete and steel? So, after all of this, what kind of pattern do you really have resting there under the desert wind? Not a secret code that unlocks the universe with a single clever equation. Not a flawless star map that has to hit every constellation, every solstice, every sacred number for the whole story to make sense. What you have is quieter than that, softer, a conversation. On one side, the earth, the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, rising just high enough above the floodplain to stay dry and stable. The slope of the land that suggests where you can anchor millions of tons of stone without watching it slide toward the river. The nearby quarries, the harbour basins, the labour villages, the storage depots. The lines of access roads, the easiest angles to drag sledges, the shortest routes for water and food. On the other side, the sky, the rising and setting sun, returning every morning no matter what the Nile does. The slow wheeling of the circumpolar stars around a point that never quite moves. The winter and summer extremes of light, the longest day and the shortest, the times when dawn and dusk arrive just a little farther north or south along the horizon. The bright stars and asterisms that seem to the Egyptians like boats, falcons, bulls, imperishable ones. The pyramids stand where those two worlds could meet in a way that felt both workable and meaningful. We can say with some confidence that the architects knew their directions, that they cared about the east-west path of the sun and the anchoring of the north. We can trace the repeating grammar of valley temple, causeway, pyramid, mortuary complex. We can see the bureaucracy in the cubic grids, in the regularized slopes, in the way later kings copy and tweak what earlier kings tried. Beyond that, the air gets thinner, those shafts pointing toward regions of the sky that once held important stars. Those causeways that seem to graze a solstice, sunrise or sunset. Those near matches to mathematical constants that sit just a little too close to be easily dismissed, and just a little too flexible to be taken as proof. Maybe some of them were intentional. Maybe some were happy accidents that priests and scribes later wrapped in story. Maybe some are only us, many centuries removed, tracing lines on maps and night skies, because our own brains are built to look for patterns in almost anything. We don't have the builders' notebooks, we don't have the design debates around the royal table. We have alignments, measurements, fragments of text, and a landscape that has been weathered and rebuilt and interpreted over and over. So the honest place to rest is in the middle. Enough is solid that you don't have to invent mysteries to feel wonder. Enough is uncertain that you never quite get to seal the box and say, this is all it ever meant. If you let that be, it can be strangely calming. You can imagine the surveyors standing with their sighting rods as the sun drops and the first bright stars appear, checking their lines, making small adjustments, satisfied enough when the angles are close and the foundations firm. You can imagine the priests, centuries later, standing in the same places and telling stories about how the causeway mirrors the sun's path, how the king's soul will rise with Orion, how the pyramid's flanks echo the first mound emerging from the primordial water. Different layers of intention, all talking to each other across time. A conversation between earth and sky, between engineers and theologians, between what had to work on an ordinary Tuesday and what had to feel eternal in the language of myth. Letting the mystery breathe means you don't have to choose just one of those voices. You can let the careful surveys coexist with the star myths. You can let the logistics of hauling limestone blocks coexist with the idea of a staircase for the king's spirit. You can hold the very human possibility that some alignments happened because they were beautiful, and some happened because they were convenient, and some happened because convenience and beauty lined up in a way that pleased everyone involved. As you lie there, maybe close to sleep, you might notice how seldom we allow ourselves that kind of in-between space. We want the pyramids either to be pure, cold engineering, or else perfect messages from the gods. All practical or all mystical, but in the Old Kingdom those categories weren't separate. Building in stone at a cosmic scale was itself an act of devotion. Getting the angle right was part of worship. Aligning to north was not just good surveying, it was placing the king into the axis of the unending sky. When you think of it that way, the mysterious pattern stops being a puzzle to solve and becomes more like a rhythm to listen to. The slow rhythm of the Nile rising and falling each year. The steadier rhythm of day and night, the even slower turning of stars no human lifetime can track from start to finish. The very brief, bright rhythm of a single king's reign, set against all of that and frozen in stone. Some parts of that rhythm we can trace with numbers, with GPS, with simulations of the ancient sky. Other parts live only in possibilities and may always stay there. If that leaves you with questions, that's all right. Questions can be a soft place to rest. You might notice as your breathing slows which ideas from this long walk along the plateau feel most satisfying to you. Is it the strict geometry of cardinal directions, the idea of causeways catching sunrises and sunsets, the echoes of Orion and the imperishable stars, or the simpler thought that human beings, given enough time and stone, will always leave behind patterns that mean more than one thing at once? If you feel like sharing, I'd be curious which theory or which layer of explanation felt most convincing to you. The practical one, the celestial one, the symbolic one, or the idea that all of them overlap. And if you're still awake enough, you can also let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there in your own little corner of the night. If this quiet journey through sand and starlight helped you drift, it does help when you gently like the video, leave a comment, or subscribe for more slow history to fall asleep to. It tells the mysterious patterns of the algorithm that this kind of calm, detailed storytelling is something you want more of. The pyramids will still be there tomorrow, still catching the same sun, still under the same sky, still holding their mixture of answers and questions. For now, you don't have to solve them. You can just let that conversation between earth and sky continue above you while you close your eyes and let your own thoughts slowly turn to stone quiet.